Hey everyone, welcome to Yellowfan. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that The Simpsons is not just a long-running television show. It is the single most unlikely success story in the history of entertainment. A show that was never supposed to exist in the first place, that was sketched on a piece of paper in a lobby by a man trying to protect his comic strip about rabbits, and that somehow went on to survive cultural wars with the White House, the departure of almost every writer who made it great, the death of irreplaceable performers, a complete visual transformation, a corporate takeover by the biggest media company on earth, and nearly 4 decades of people saying it was not as good as it used to be. The Simpsons survived all of that and kept going, and the reasons why come down to 3 things: an origin story so strange it sounds made up, a golden age so brilliant it set a standard that no comedy has matched since, and a stubbornness to keep existing that has turned a crude little cartoon about a yellow family into the longest running scripted show in American television history. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Life in Hell and the Lobby Sketch: How the Simpsons Were Born. Before The Simpsons became the longest running animated show in American history, before Homer and Bart became household names in every country on Earth, before the yellow skin, and 4 fingers became one of the most recognized images in all of television, the entire thing almost never happened. The Simpsons exist because of a nervous cartoonist, a last-minute decision in a waiting room, and a set of drawings so rough that the animators thought they were looking at unfinished sketches. The story of how this show came to life is one of the strangest origin stories in entertainment, and it all starts with a completely different comic strip about rabbits. In the early 1980s, Matt Groening was not a famous television creator. He was not working in Hollywood. He was not making millions of dollars. He was a guy from Portland, Oregon, living in Los Angeles, working at a record store, and drawing a small underground comic strip called Life in Hell. The comic featured 2 rabbits named Binky and Sheba, along with a pair of identical characters named Akbar and Jeff, who always wore matching hats. Life in Hell was dark, funny, and weird. It dealt with work, school, relationships, and the general feeling that modern life was kind of terrible. Groening had been drawing it since the late 1970s, and by the mid-1980s it had built a loyal following in alternative newspapers across the United States. It was not mainstream, it was not for kids, but it was good enough that the right people started to notice. One of those people was James L. Brooks. Now, Brooks was already a giant in the television world at that point. He had created the Mary Tyler Moore Show in the 1970s, which changed the entire landscape of American comedy. He had won Academy Awards for his film Terms of Endearment. He was one of the most respected producers in Hollywood. And in the mid-1980s, he was putting together a new variety show for a brand new television network called Fox. The show was called The Tracey Ullman Show, and it starred the British comedian and actress Tracey Ullman. It featured sketch comedy, musical numbers with choreography by Paula Abdul, and live-action performances from a cast that included Dan Castellaneta and Julie Kavner. But Brooks wanted something extra. He wanted short animated segments that would play before and after the commercial breaks, little cartoon bumpers to keep viewers watching through the ads. Brooks had seen Groening's Life in Hell comic strip and liked what he saw. He reached out to Groening and asked him to come in and pitch ideas for these animated shorts. Groening was thrilled. This was a real opportunity to get his work on national television. He planned to walk into that meeting and pitch an animated version of Life in Hell. Binky the Rabbit and all his friends would come to life on screen. It seemed like a perfect fit. But then, something happened that changed everything. As Groening sat in the lobby of Brooks's office waiting for the meeting, he started to think about what an animated Life in Hell would actually mean. He realized that if he handed over his comic strip to a television network, he would have to give up the rights to his own creation. Life in Hell was his. He had been drawing it for years. It was his personal work, his identity as an artist. If Fox owned the animated version, Groening could lose control of the whole thing. The comic strip, the characters, all of it could end up belonging to someone else. He could not let that happen. Life in Hell was his life's work, and he was not about to sign it away. So right there in the lobby, with the meeting just minutes away, Matt Groening made a decision that that would change television forever. He grabbed a piece of paper and started sketching something completely new. He drew a family, a father, a mother, a son, a daughter, and a baby. He made them quickly and simply, with big round eyes and wild hair. He named them after his own family members. The father was Homer, named after Groening's real father. The mother was Marge, named after his real mother. The daughters were Lisa and Maggie, named after his real sisters. And the son, well, Groening did not name the son after himself. Instead, he came up with the name Bart, which was an anagram of the word brat. He later said that he thought Simpson was a funny last name because it sounded like simpleton. Groening walked into that meeting and pitched this brand new family to James L. Brooks. Brooks liked it. He saw something in these crude little drawings, something funny and real and different from anything else on television. The deal was made. Matt Groening's new family would become the animated shorts on the Tracy Ullman Show. Now came the hard part. Somebody had to actually turn these sketches into animation. The job went to Klasky Supo, a small animation studio in Los Angeles. The team of animators included Wes Archer, David Silverman, and Bill Kopp. And here is where one of the most important accidents in television history happened. Groening had submitted very basic, very rough drawings of the characters. He assumed that the professional animators at Klasky Supo would take his sketches and clean them up. They would smooth out the lines, fix the proportions, and make the characters look polished and professional. That is what normally happens when a creator hands off character designs to an animation studio. But that is not what happened. The animators at Klasky Supo looked at Groening's sketches and simply traced over them. They did not clean anything up. They did not smooth anything out. They kept the crude, rough, slightly off look of Groening's original drawings. And that is why the Simpson family in those earliest shorts looked so strange and wobbly compared to what we know today. It was never supposed to look that way. It was an accident. But it ended up giving the show a raw, handmade quality that set it apart from the cleaner, more polished cartoons of that era. Then came the question of color. The colorist working on the shorts was a woman named Gheorghe Pelus. She had to decide what color to make the character's skin. Now, here's the thing about the Simpson family. Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie do not have normal hairlines. Their hair just sits on top of their heads without any visible line where the skin ends and the hair begins. Pelus realized that if she colored them in a normal human skin tone, they would look strange. The lack of a hairline would be confusing and weird, so she made a bold choice. She colored them yellow. Bright, unmistakable yellow. When Groening saw it, he loved it. He thought it was hilarious that Marge was yellow with blue hair, and he told them to keep it. That decision, made by a colorist trying to solve a practical problem, became one of the most recognizable visual choices in the history of television. The voice cast came together in a similarly unusual way. Dan Castellaneta and Julie Kavner were already part of the Tracy Ullman Show's live-action cast, so they were given the roles of Homer and Marge without any auditions needed. Castellaneta's original voice for Homer was very different from what we hear today. He based it on an impression of the actor Walter Matthau, giving Homer a deeper, grouchier, more rough-sounding voice. It would take time for Homer's voice to soften and evolve into the version we all recognize now. For the children, the producers held auditions. Nancy Cartwright came in to read for the role of Lisa, but when she arrived, she looked at the character descriptions and saw that Lisa was described simply as the middle child, with not much personality at that point. Cartwright was not interested. She later said she did not want to be the boring middle child. She wanted something with more energy. So she asked to read for Bart instead. She gave a demonstration of a bratty 10-year-old boy's voice, and Matt Groening and the producers hired her on the spot. Meanwhile, Yardley Smith had originally been asked to audition for Bart, but casting director Bonita Piatilla felt her voice was too high for the role, so she was given Lisa instead. Smith remains the only main cast member who regularly voices just one character on the show. The recording process for these early shorts was about as far from professional as you can imagine. According to Cartwright, the dialogue was recorded on a portable tape deck in a makeshift studio. This studio was actually the video engineer suite located above the bleachers on the Tracy Ullman Show set. There was no fancy sound booth, no state-of-the-art recording equipment, just actors reading lines into a tape recorder above a set of bleachers. It was simple, it was cheap, and it worked. The very first Simpsons short was called Good Night. It aired on April 19, 1987, on the third episode of the Tracy Ullman Show's first season. The short was written and storyboarded by Groening himself. It showed Homer and Marge putting the kids to bed, with each family member having trouble falling asleep. It ran for just about a minute and a half, split into 4 short segments that played around the commercial breaks. It was rough. It was simple, and most people watching that night probably did not think much of it. During the first season of the Tracy Ullman Show, the Simpsons shorts did not even appear in every episode. They shared time with another set of animated shorts called Dr. N'Godatu, which featured a completely different set of characters. The Simpsons appeared in about 7 episodes that first season, alternating with the other cartoon. But there was something about the Simpson family that connected with viewers in a way that Dr. N'Godatu never did. The reaction to the Simpsons shorts was strong and positive. By the second season of the Tracy Ullman Show, the Simpsons were appearing in almost every episode. Dr. N'Godatu disappeared and was never seen again. Over the next 2 years, 48 Simpsons shorts aired across 3 seasons of the Tracy Ullman Show. In the first 2 seasons, the shorts were split into small pieces that played before and after commercial breaks. By the 3rd season, they had graduated to full segments that played between the live-action portions of the show. The characters became more refined with each passing short. The animation got a little cleaner, the voices became more defined, and the family's personalities started to take shape. Bart became the troublemaker. Lisa became the smart one. Homer became the lovable but clueless father. Marge became the patient glue holding everything together, and Maggie, the baby, stayed silent. By 1989, the Tracy Ullman Show was wrapping up, but the Simpson family had become the most popular part of the entire program. A marketing study found that only about 14% of Americans were familiar with the shorts while they aired on the Tracy Ullman Show. That number would explode in the months to come. Because Fox and James L. Brooks saw what they had, and they made the decision to give this crude little cartoon family something much bigger than a 1-minute bumper segment. They were going to give The Simpsons their own show. The final Simpsons short, called TV Simpsons, aired on May 14, 1989. 7 months later, on December 17, 1989, The Simpsons would premiere as a full half-hour series with a Christmas special that would change the course of television history and the course of the Fox network itself in ways that nobody could have predicted. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But getting from those rough little shorts to a real television show was not as simple as it sounds. And the behind-the-scenes story of how that first season came together is a story of chaos, rewrites, and an animation disaster that almost killed the whole thing before it even started. Section 2. From Shorts to Series, the Christmas Special and Season 1. The Simpsons had proven themselves in 1-minute chunks on the Tracy Ullman Show. Audiences liked the Yellow family. The shorts were the most popular part of the entire program. But turning a collection of tiny cartoon segments into a full half-hour television series is a completely different challenge. It is the difference between writing a funny text message and writing an entire book. The characters had to carry real stories now. They needed depth, emotion, and enough material to fill 22 minutes of screen time every single week. And the people responsible for making that happen had to build an entire show from scratch, with a brand new writing staff, a brand new production pipeline, and a network that had only been on the air for a couple of years. What happened behind the scenes during the creation of that first season was messy, stressful, and at one point nearly ended the whole thing before a single episode made it to air. The first major move was made by James L. Brooks. Before production even started, Brooks negotiated something into the contract with Fox that would shape the entire future of the show. He got Fox to agree to a provision that prevented the network from interfering with the content of The Simpsons. This was huge. On most television shows, the network has the power to step in and tell the creators what they can and cannot do. They can demand changes to scripts, force the removal of jokes they think are too risky, and push the show in whatever direction they think will get the best ratings. Brooks made sure that could not happen with The Simpsons. Fox could air the show, but they could not touch it. This gave the creative team a level of freedom that was almost unheard of in network television, and it meant that The Simpsons could be as sharp, as weird, and as honest as the people making it wanted it to be. Matt Groening said his goal was to offer the audience an alternative to what he called the mainstream trash that they were watching. That protection from Fox gave him and the rest of the team the room to do exactly that. The next critical piece was bringing in Sam Simon. Simon had been a co-writer on the Tracey Ullman Show alongside Brooks, so he already had a connection to the project. He came on board as the creative supervisor for The Simpsons, and his impact on the show cannot be overstated. While Groening created the characters and the world, and Brooks provided the vision and the protection from the network, it was Sam Simon who built the machine that actually made the show work week after week. His most important contribution was assembling the original writing staff, and the group of writers he put together might be the most talented collection of comedy minds ever gathered in one room. The first writers hired were Al Jean and Mike Reiss, who became the very first members of the original writing staff. They had been writing partners since their days at Harvard University, and had worked together on shows like The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, Alf, and It's Gary Shandling's Show. Along with Gene and Rice, Simon brought in John Swartzwelder, who would go on to write more episodes of The Simpsons than anyone else in the show's history. He brought in John Vitti, George Meyer, Jeff Martin, Jay Kogan, and Wallace Wolodarski. Each of these writers brought something different to the table, but together they created a voice for the show that was smart without being pretentious, emotional without being sappy, and funny in ways that no other show on television had ever really been. The showrunners for the first 2 seasons were Matt Groening, James L. Brooks, and Sam Simon. All 3 of them had executive producer credits and shared the responsibility of guiding the show through its early days. But the relationship between them was not always smooth. In fact, Simon was constantly at odds with Groening and Brooks and the show's production company, Gracie Films. The creative disagreements were real and they were intense. But even with the tension behind the scenes, the work that came out of that first season was something special. Production on the first full-length episode began, and this is where things got complicated. The very first episode that the team actually produced was called Some Enchanted Evening. They wrote it, recorded the voices, sent it off to the animation studio, and waited for the finished product to come back. When it did, they were horrified. The animation was a disaster. The characters looked wrong, the movements were stiff and awkward, and the overall quality was so far below what they needed that the episode could not be aired. It was a genuine crisis. The show had not even premiered yet, and they were already dealing with a major production failure. The team had to scramble. They pushed Some Enchanted Evening to the back of the line to be reworked and fixed, and it would not actually air until May of 1990 as the very last episode of the first season. Instead, they needed a different episode to serve as the series premiere. The episode they chose was Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, a Christmas special that would introduce the Simpson family to the world in a big way. Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire aired on December 17, 1989. The story was simple but effective. It is Christmas time in Springfield, and the Simpson family is getting ready for the holidays. But things go wrong almost immediately. Bart gets a tattoo, and Marge has to spend the family's Christmas savings to get it removed. At the same time, Homer finds out that his Christmas bonus from the nuclear power plant has been canceled. The family is broke, and Homer is too proud to tell anyone, so he secretly takes a job as a shopping mall Santa Claus, wearing the red suit and sitting in a chair while kids tell him what they want for Christmas. But even the Santa job barely pays anything. Desperate, Homer takes his son Bart to the dog racing track on Christmas Eve, hoping to win enough money to save Christmas. They bet on a dog, and they lose. But then something happens. A skinny, sad-looking greyhound named Santa's Little Helper is abandoned by his owner after losing the race. Homer and Bart take the dog home, and the family has a Christmas after all. It is not the Christmas they planned, but it is real, and it is theirs. That first episode set the tone for what The Simpsons would become. It was funny, yes, but it was also emotional. Homer was not just a cartoon dad making jokes. He was a guy who loved his family and was trying his best, even when his best was not very good. The show had heart, and that heart was there from the very first episode. It also introduced the audience to the world of Springfield in a natural way. We saw the Simpson house, the nuclear power plant where Homer worked, the school where Bart and Lisa went, and the general feel of this small American town filled with characters who felt both ridiculous and completely real at the same time. The first season consisted of 13 episodes, which was a shorter run than the typical American television season at the time. The show aired on Sunday nights on Fox, and at first it was not an instant hit. It was slow to gain an audience. People were not sure what to make of it. Animated shows in prime time were not really a thing in 1989. The last time a cartoon had been a major player in the primetime lineup was the Flintstones back in the 1960s. The idea that a cartoon could compete with live-action sitcoms and dramas seemed strange to a lot of viewers, and even to a lot of people within the television industry. But as more episodes aired, word started to spread. People started talking about this weird yellow family on Fox, and the audience began to grow. Those 13 episodes of Season 1 laid the groundwork for everything that would follow. The show introduced characters and locations that would become permanent fixtures of the series for decades to come. We met Mr. Burns, the ancient, heartless billionaire who owned the Springfield nuclear power plant where Homer worked. We met Waylon Smithers, Burns's loyal and devoted assistant. We met Ned Flanders, the Simpson family's impossibly cheerful and religious next-door neighbor. We met Krusty the Clown, the beloved but deeply troubled children's television host. We met Moe Sislak, the grumpy bartender at Moe's Tavern, where Homer and his friends drank beer after work. We met Barney Gumble, Homer's best friend and the town drunk. We met Principal Skinner, the strict but weary principal at Springfield Elementary. And we met dozens of other characters who made Springfield feel like a real place filled with real people, even though every single one of them was bright yellow and had 4 fingers. The writing in that first season was sharp from the start. Episodes like Bart the Genius, which aired on January 14, 1990, as the first regular episode after the Christmas special, showed that the show could balance comedy with real emotional stakes. In that episode, Bart cheats on an intelligence test and is mistakenly placed in a school for gifted children. The comedy comes from Bart being completely out of his depth, but the emotional core is about a kid who just wants his father to be proud of him. When Homer finally finds out the truth, the scene is not played just for laughs. There is real disappointment and real hurt, and it hits harder because you care about these characters. Other first season episodes tackled everything from Homer's insecurity about being a bad father to Lisa's struggle to be taken seriously as the smart kid in a family that does not always understand her. Moaning Lisa explored Lisa's depression in a way that was surprisingly real for a cartoon, with Marge eventually telling Lisa that she does not have to smile and pretend everything is fine just to make other people comfortable. These moments gave the show a depth that separated it from anything else in animation at the time. The animation itself improved as the season went on, but it still had a rough, handmade quality that gave the show its own unique look. The characters moved in slightly awkward ways, the backgrounds were simple, and everything had a warmth to it that came from the fact that real human hands were drawing every single frame. The show was animated at Klasky Supo, the same studio that had produced the original shorts, and while the quality was a big step up from those early bumper segments, it was still far from the polished look that the show would develop in later years. By the time Some Enchanted Evening finally aired on May 13, 1990, as the last episode of the first season, The Simpsons had already proven that it was something more than a novelty. It was not just a cartoon for kids. It was not just a silly comedy for adults. It was both of those things and neither of those things. It was its own category, a show that could make you laugh and then make you feel something real in the span of a single scene. And the audience that had slowly built over the course of those 13 episodes was about to explode in a way that nobody, not Groening, not Brooks, not Simon, not Fox, and certainly not the rest of the television industry was prepared for. The show had also proven something to the Fox network specifically. The Simpsons became Fox's first series to land in the top 30 ratings in a season. This was a massive deal for a network that was still trying to establish itself as a legitimate competitor to the big three networks of NBC, CBS, and ABC. Fox was the new kid, the scrappy underdog, and The Simpsons was helping them prove that they belonged. The network noticed. They were about to bet big on this yellow family, and the gamble they made heading into 1990 would turn Bart Simpson into the most famous cartoon character on the planet and set off a cultural wave so massive that it reached the White House, the schoolyard, and every flea market in America. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But nobody could have predicted just how big things were about to get, or how a 10-year-old cartoon troublemaker was about to become the most controversial figure in American pop culture overnight. Section 3. Bart Mania. When a cartoon took over America. There is a moment in the life of every television show where it either stays as just another program people watch, or it breaks through the screen and becomes part of the culture itself. For The Simpsons, that moment came in 1990, and it did not come quietly. It came like a tidal wave. Within months of the show's premiere as a full series, a 10-year-old cartoon boy with spiky yellow hair and a bad attitude became the most talked about, most marketed, most loved, and most hated character in all of American entertainment. The phenomenon had a name. People called it Bart Mania, and for a brief, wild, intense period of time, Bart Simpson was not just a cartoon character. He was the single biggest thing in popular culture, and the reaction he caused split the entire country in two. It started with the merchandise. The moment The Simpsons took off as a series, Fox and its licensing partners flooded the market with products. T-shirts, posters, buttons, towels, dolls, lunchboxes, bumper stickers, mugs, hats, and anything else you could slap a yellow face on. But it was the t-shirts that became the center of everything. Bart Simpson t-shirts were everywhere, not just in stores, but on the streets, in schools, at malls, on playgrounds, in every corner of American life. At the peak of the craze, Bart Simpson t-shirts were selling at a rate of roughly 1 million per day. That number is almost hard to believe, but the demand was real. Within the first 14 months of Simpsons merchandise hitting the shelves, the products had generated over $2 billion in revenue. $2 billion! For a cartoon that had been on the air for less than 2 years. Bart was the face of all of it. Even in episodes where Bart was not the main character, he was the one Fox used in advertisements and promotions. He was the most marketable member of the family, and everyone involved in selling The Simpsons knew it. His catchphrases were everywhere. Eat my shorts. Ay caramba. Don't have a cow, man. These phrases became part of the way kids talked to each other in 1990 and 1991. If you were a kid during that time, you heard those words on the playground every single day. And the most popular t-shirts carried slogans that perfectly captured Bart's rebellious attitude. Underachiever and proud of it was printed on millions of shirts. I'm Bart Simpson, who the hell are you? Was another one that sold like crazy. Bart was a proud troublemaker who talked back to authority, did not care about school, and thought the whole idea of being a good kid was boring. And children across America loved him for it. Entertainment Weekly named Bart Simpson their Entertainer of the Year for 1990. He became a balloon float at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade that same year. A cartoon 10-year-old was being treated like a real celebrity, and the attention was not coming from just kids. Adults were fascinated too. The Simpsons was pulling viewers of all ages because the writing worked on multiple levels. Kids laughed at Bart's pranks and one-liners. Adults laughed at the sharper jokes about politics, society, and the everyday frustrations of being a grown-up. The show was something the whole family could watch together, even though the whole point of the show was that this particular family was a beautiful mess. But with all that popularity came something else. Backlash. And it hit hard and fast. The first wave of criticism came from schools. Principals and teachers across the United States started banning Bart Simpson t-shirts from their classrooms. The slogans were the main target. Underachiever and proud of it made educators furious. They argued that Bart was teaching kids that it was cool to not care about school, that failing was something to be proud of, and that disrespecting adults was funny rather than wrong. At Lutz Elementary, Bart shirts were banned outright because the school believed the character was a bad influence on children. Other schools across the country followed with similar bans. The t-shirts that used the word hell in I'm Bart Simpson, who the hell are you? Were singled out as especially inappropriate for children. The department store JCPenney, which had been selling Bart merchandise, actually pulled the shirts from their stores after customers complained. The anger did not stop at the schoolyard. Conservative groups in the United States took aim at The Simpsons as a whole. They saw the show as a threat to American family values. Here was a cartoon where the father was lazy and dumb, the son was a disrespectful troublemaker, the family went to church but clearly did not take it seriously, and the overall message seemed to be that dysfunction was normal and maybe even lovable. For people who believe that television should show families the right way to live, The Simpsons was the worst thing on the air. And then the criticism reached the highest level of power in the country. In 1990, First Lady Barbara Bush gave an interview to People magazine in which she called The Simpsons the dumbest thing I had ever seen. The wife of the President of the United States had publicly trashed a cartoon. But that was just the beginning. President George H.W. Bush himself weighed in during a speech, declaring that he wanted to make American families a lot more like the Waltons and a lot less like the Simpsons. The Waltons, of course, were the wholesome, hard-working, Depression-era family from the classic 1970s television drama. By comparing the two shows, the president was making it clear where he thought The Simpsons fell on the scale of American values. It was a direct shot at the show, delivered from the White House. Now, most television shows would have crumbled under that kind of pressure. When the President of the United States calls you out by name, that is serious. But the people behind The Simpsons did not back down. They leaned into it. The show fired back at the Bush family in the most Simpsons way possible. Bart Simpson himself responded to the president's comments, saying that the Simpsons were just like the Waltons because they were both praying for an end to the Depression. It was sharp, it was quick, and it was exactly the kind of clever pushback that made people love the show in the first place. A cartoon 10-year-old had just dunked on the commander-in-chief, and it only made the show more popular. That clip of Bush's speech was even worked into the show itself, and the whole incident became part of Simpsons history. The controversy did exactly what controversies often do for entertainment that is already good. It made more people curious. People who had never watched the show tuned in to see what all the fuss was about. And many of them stayed because the show was genuinely great. The White House criticism, the school bans, the outrage from parents groups, all of it fed directly into the rebellious spirit that the show was built on. The Simpsons had been marketed from the very beginning as a family that was not like the perfect television families of the past. Early promos for the show made a point of saying that this was not the Bradys or the Cleavers. The Bushes calling them out only proved the point. While all of this official controversy was playing out, something even stranger was happening on the streets. Bootleg Bart Simpson t-shirts became their own cultural movement. Independent sellers at flea markets and street corners started producing unlicensed Bart merchandise that took the character in directions Fox never intended. The most famous of these were the Black Bart t-shirts, which reimagined Bart Simpson as a black character. These shirts showed Bart dressed as famous African-American athletes and celebrities like Michael Jordan and Bo Jackson. Some featured rap lyrics or references to black culture. The Black Bart shirts were not made by Fox or any official licensing partner. They were created by independent marketers who saw Bart mania happening and wanted to be part of it in their own way. These bootleg shirts became hugely popular at flea markets and thrift stores, particularly in black communities, and they lasted as a cultural item well into the early 1990s. They eventually faded out around late 1992 when other bootleg trends, like crisscross-themed Bugs Bunny and Tasmanian Devil shirts, took over. But for a couple of years, Black Bart was one of the most visible pieces of street-level merchandise in America. Fox also made a major business decision in the summer of 1990 that showed just how much confidence they had in the show. They moved The Simpsons from its Sunday night time slot to Thursday nights at 8 o'clock. This was not a random scheduling change. Thursday at 8 was occupied by The Cosby Show on NBC, which had been the most watched show in America for most of the 1980s. Bill Cosby's sitcom about the Huxtable family was a ratings giant, and Fox was putting their cartoon directly up against it. It was a bold, almost reckless move. A brand new animated show on a brand new network going head-to-head with the biggest sitcom on television. But Fox believed in The Simpsons, and the gamble paid off. The Simpsons pulled viewers away from The Cosby Show, particularly younger viewers who found Bart more exciting than Cliff Huxtable. The ratings battle between the two shows became one of the biggest television stories of 1990, and it helped cement Fox's reputation as a network that was willing to take risks and fight for attention. The cultural reach of Bart mania went beyond just America. The Simpsons was being broadcast internationally, and Bart's image was showing up in countries around the world. The show became one of the most recognizable pieces of American culture being exported globally. People who did not even speak English knew who Bart Simpson was just from seeing his face on a t-shirt or a poster. The yellow skin, the spiky hair, the skateboard, the attitude, it all translated across language barriers in a way that very few television characters ever had. But here's the thing about Bart mania that is easy to forget if you were not there for it. It burned incredibly bright, but it also started to cool down faster than people expected. By the mid-1990s, the intense craze around Bart specifically had settled. The t-shirt sales slowed, The bootleg market moved on to other characters. The school bands stopped being news. Bart was still famous, still beloved, still one of the most iconic cartoon characters ever created, but the white-hot mania of 1990 and 1991 could not last forever. Nothing that intense ever does. What replaced Bart mania, though, was something far more interesting and far more lasting. As the initial wave of merchandise madness and cultural controversy faded, what remained was the show itself. And the show was getting better. While the world had been focused on Bart's face on a t-shirt, the writing staff inside the Simpsons offices had been quietly doing some of the best work in the history of American television. The show was evolving. The characters were getting deeper. The stories were getting smarter. The jokes were getting sharper. Bart may have been the one who grabbed America's attention, but it was the show as a whole that kept it. The early 1990s were also the period where something shifted in who the real star of The Simpsons was. When the show first exploded, Bart was the clear headliner. He was the one in the merchandise, the one in the ads, the one everyone talked about. But as the writing staff dug deeper into the characters and started telling more complex stories, a different Simpson started moving to the center. Homer, the father. The guy who was supposed to be the background character in a show about a bratty kid. Homer Simpson was becoming the funniest, most layered, and most relatable character on the show. And the writers were discovering that his combination of stupidity, selfishness, and genuine love for his family was comedy gold in a way that Bart's rebellion could never quite match over the long run. Bart was the firecracker that got everyone's attention. Homer was the engine that would keep the show running for decades. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And as Bart mania faded and the show entered its third and fourth seasons, something incredible happened. The Simpsons did not just stay good, it got better. Much better. The show entered a stretch of episodes so brilliant, so consistently funny, and so emotionally perfect that fans and critics would eventually give it a name. They called it the Golden Age. And the people responsible for making it happen were two writers who had been there from the very beginning, waiting for their turn to run the show. Section 4. The Golden Age begins. Al Jean, Mike Reiss, and the Writers' Room. Every long-running television show has a period that fans look back on as the best it ever was. For some shows, that peak lasts a few episodes. For others, it might stretch across a single great season. But The Simpsons did something that almost no other show in the history of television has ever done. It hit a level of quality so high and maintained it for so long that the period earned its own title. Fans and critics call it the Golden Age of The Simpsons. And it began when two writers who had been with the show since the very beginning were finally given the keys to the whole operation. Their names were Al Jean and Mike Reiss, and what they did with seasons 3 and 4 set the standard for everything the show would become. Al Jean and Mike Reiss had known each other since their days at Harvard University. Jean had grown up near Detroit, Michigan, and was a mathematics major at Harvard. Reiss was from Bristol, Connecticut, and had felt like an outsider for most of his school years before arriving at college. The two of them connected at Harvard and began writing together. They were both incredibly smart, both deeply funny, and both driven to make careers in comedy. After college, they worked as a writing team on several shows, including The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, Alf, and It's Gary Shandling's Show. They had proven themselves as skilled comedy writers well before The Simpsons came along. When The Simpsons was being put together as a series in 1989, Al Jean and Mike Reiss were the very first writers hired for the original writing staff. Sam Simon brought them on, and they wrote episodes for the first 2 seasons while the show was being run by Matt Groening, James L. Brooks, and Simon himself. They learned the show from the inside out during those early years. They understood the characters, the tone, the rhythms of how a Simpsons episode worked. They knew what made the show funny, and more importantly, they knew what made it feel real. So when the time came for someone new to step up and run the show, starting with season 3, Gene and Reese were the obvious choice. Their first episode as showrunners was Mr. Lisa Goes to Washington, which aired on September 26, 1991, as the season 3 premiere. And right from the start, they felt the pressure. Running The Simpsons was not just running any television show. By 1991, this was one of the most watched and most talked about programs in the country. Millions of people tuned in every week. Critics were paying close attention, and the expectations were enormous. Gene later talked about how the weight of that responsibility hit them hard. They did 6 to 7 complete rewrites of that first script because Gene kept thinking it was not good enough. Every time they finished a draft, he would read it and feel like it needed to be funnier, tighter, better. That level of perfectionism was exhausting, but it was also exactly what the show needed at that moment in its life. What Gene and Reese brought to the show was depth. The first 2 seasons had established the characters and the world of Springfield. The audience knew who Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie were. They knew the town, the supporting characters, and the general feel of the show. But Gene and Reese took all of that and pushed it further. They gave the characters more layers. They wrote stories that were not just funny, but genuinely moving. They found ways to make the audience care about these yellow cartoon people on a deeper level than the show had reached before, while also making the comedy sharper and more clever at the same time. It was an incredibly difficult balance to strike, and they made it look easy. The way the writing room operated under Gene and Reese was a reflection of their partnership. Gene focused more on the emotional and dramatic side of the show. He cared deeply about making sure the stories had heart, and that the family dynamics felt authentic. Reese, on the other hand, leaned more into the comedy. He was the one pushing for bigger laughs, better gags, and tighter joke writing. He led the writing team and focused on making sure every script was as funny as it could possibly be. Together, they covered both sides of what made The Simpsons special. The show was never just a comedy. It was a comedy that could make you feel things. And under Gene and Reese, that combination reached a new level. One of the most important things Gene and Reese did during their time as showrunners was hire new writers who would go on to shape the show for years to come. The most famous of these hires was a young man named Conan O'Brien. Before he became one of the most well-known talk show hosts in America, Conan O'Brien was a comedy writer, and one of his first major jobs was writing for The Simpsons. He was brought onto the staff during the Gene and Rice era, and he contributed some of the most beloved episodes in the show's entire run. His most famous Simpsons script was Marge vs. The Monorail, an episode that is consistently ranked as one of the greatest in the show's history. The episode featured a fast-talking con man named Lyle Lanley, who convinces the town of Springfield to build a monorail using money they received from fining Mr. Burns for illegal waste dumping. The whole thing is a disaster, of course, because the monorail is cheaply built and nearly kills everyone. The episode was a perfect mix of sharp satire, absurd comedy, and catchy musical numbers, and it showed what The Simpsons writing room was capable of when it was firing on all cylinders. The episodes that came out of seasons 3 and 4 are stacked with classics that fans still talk about decades later. Homer at the Bat brought in 9 real Major League Baseball players as guest stars for a story about the Springfield nuclear power plant softball team. Chris Turner, the author of a book called Planet Simpson, specifically pointed to Homer at the Bat as the episode that marked the beginning of the Golden Age. It was the moment where everything clicked. The writing, the comedy, the guest stars, the heart, all of it came together in a way that felt effortless. Flaming Moe's told the story of Homer inventing a cocktail that he shared with Moe the bartender, only for Moe to steal the recipe and take all the credit. It was a story about friendship, betrayal, and the small injustices of everyday life, wrapped in some of the funniest writing the show had ever produced. Mr. Plow followed Homer as he bought a snowplow and started his own business, clearing driveways after a blizzard, only to find himself in a bitter rivalry with Barney Gumble, who started a competing service. Last Exit to Springfield is often cited by fans and critics as the single greatest episode of The Simpsons ever made. It centered on Homer accidentally becoming the leader of the union at the nuclear power plant and going head-to-head with Mr. Burns over the workers' dental plan. It featured a perfect blend of political satire, movie references, and character comedy, and it managed to be both hilarious and surprisingly smart about labor politics without ever feeling like it was lecturing the audience. Season 3 was particularly remarkable for its consistency. It contained 24 episodes, making it the only season of The Simpsons to reach that number. And across those 24 episodes, the quality barely dipped. The season won 6 Primetime Emmy Awards for Outstanding Voiceover Performance, and it was also nominated for Outstanding Animated Program. Episode after episode delivered the kind of writing that other shows could only dream of. Radio Bart was placed on Entertainment Weekly's list of the 25 best Simpsons episodes. Homer at the Bat and Flaming Moe's appeared on the same list. The show was operating at a level where even the episodes that fans consider lesser from this period would be the high point of most other shows' entire runs. But the Golden Age was not just about comedy. It was also about what was happening behind the scenes, particularly with the man who had built the foundation that Gene and Reese were now building on. Sam Simon, the creative supervisor who had assembled the original writing staff and shaped the show's voice during its first 4 seasons, left The Simpsons after season 4. His departure was not a happy one. Simon had been constantly at odds with Matt Groening, James L. Brooks, and the production company Gracie Films throughout his time on the show. The creative disagreements had been building for years, and by the end of season 4, the relationship had become too damaged to continue. But Sam Simon was smart enough to know what he had helped create. Before leaving, he negotiated a deal that would keep him tied to the show financially for the rest of its life. The deal gave Simon a share of the show's profits every single year and an executive producer credit on every episode, even though he would never work on The Simpsons again after walking away. That deal held from 1993 until Simon's death in 2015, meaning he earned money from the show for over 20 years after his last day of actual work on it. Former Simpsons director Brad Bird described Simon as the unsung hero of The Simpsons, and many people who worked on the show during those early years agreed. Groening may have created the characters, and Brooks may have protected the show from the network, but it was Simon who built the writing room and the creative process that made it all work. The departure of Sam Simon was a significant moment, but it was not the only major change happening at the end of the Gene and Reese era. Gene and Reese themselves were getting ready to leave. After running the show for 2 seasons, they made the decision to step away from The Simpsons to create their own animated series called The Critic. The show, which starred John Lovitz as a film critic named Jay Sherman, premiered on ABC in January 1994. It was well received by critics, but struggled to find an audience and lasted only 2 seasons. The Critic would later cause a small controversy when James L. Brooks arranged for the character of Jay Sherman to appear in a Simpsons episode called A Star is Burns, as a way to promote the Critic's move to Fox. Matt Groening was not happy about it. He publicly complained that the crossover was essentially a 30-minute advertisement for the Critic, and felt it was beneath The Simpsons. Brooks fired back, pointing out that Gene and Reese had poured years of their lives into making The Simpsons great, and that Groening had benefited enormously from their work. It was a rare public fight between the people at the top of the show, and it showed that the tensions behind the scenes were real, even during the best years of the series. But looking back at what Gene and Reese accomplished during seasons 3 and 4, the numbers and the accolades only tell part of the story. What they really did was prove that The Simpsons was not a fad. Bart mania had come and gone. The t-shirt sales had slowed down. The controversy with the White House had faded from the headlines. But the show itself was better than ever, And it was better because the writing had gotten better. Gene and Reese showed that The Simpsons could survive the loss of its initial cultural hype and actually thrive by doubling down on quality. They set a standard that every showrunner who came after them would be measured against. Bill Oakley, who would later run the show himself, summed it up as directly as anyone ever has. He called season 3 the best season of any TV show of all time. Not the best season of The Simpsons, not the best season of an animated show, the best season of any show, period. Coming from someone who spent years inside The Simpsons writer's room and understood exactly what went into making those episodes, that is about as strong an endorsement as you can get. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And when Gene and Reese left to pursue The Critic, the question hanging over the show was an obvious one. Could The Simpsons keep this level of quality going without the people who had just delivered 2 of the greatest seasons in television history? The answer would come from a new showrunner who had a completely different vision for the show. A man who would push the comedy into stranger, wilder, and more unpredictable territory than it had ever gone before. Section 5. Mkin's Revolution and the Peak of the Golden Age. When Al Jean and Mike Reiss left The Simpsons after Season 4 to create The Critic, they left behind a show that was at the top of its game. The writing was the best it had ever been. The characters were deeper and more beloved than ever. The audience was loyal and growing. But they also left behind a writer's room that was almost completely empty. Most of the original staff members who had built the show from the ground up were gone. The great wave of talent that Sam Simon had assembled back in 1989 had scattered to other projects, other shows, other careers. When the dust settled after Season 4, only 4 writers remained on the staff: Bill Oakley, Josh Weinstein, Conan O'Brien, and Dan McGrath were the only ones still standing. And Conan O'Brien would not be around for long either, because he was about to leave to take over as the host of Late Night on NBC, replacing David Letterman. The Simpsons was heading into its 5th season with almost no one left to write it. This was the situation that David Mkin walked into. James L. Brooks and producer Richard Sakai hired Mkin to take over as the new showrunner, and he became the first person to run The Simpsons completely on his own. Gene and Reese had been a team. The original trio of Groening, Brooks, and Simon had shared the load across 3 people, but Mkin was solo. Everything fell on his shoulders, and the challenge in front of him was enormous. He did not just have to maintain the quality of one of the best shows on television, he had to rebuild the entire operation from the ground up while doing it. Mkin was not a stranger to television comedy, but his background was very different from the people who had run the show before him. He was known for his work on a surreal Fox comedy called Get a Life, which starred Chris Elliott, and a sketch series called The Edge. His sense of humor leaned heavily toward the bizarre, the absurd, and the unexpected. He had actually been asked to join The Simpsons writing staff back when the show first started in 1989, but he turned it down to work on Get a Life instead. He was a fan of The Simpsons before being hired as showrunner, and he started working on the show in November 1992. Because of the show's long production cycle, the episodes he oversaw would not start airing until September 1993. The first thing Mkin had to do was hire a whole new room of writers, and the people he brought in turned out to be some of the most talented comedy minds of their generation. Among his new hires were David X. Cohen, who would go on to co-create Futurama with Matt Groening, and Greg Daniels, who would go on to create King of the Hill and later adapt The Office for American television. Mkin had to build a new team while also learning the rhythms of a show that had been running for 4 years without him. It was a huge amount of work, but Mkin later described the experience of rebuilding the staff as exciting rather than overwhelming. He saw it as a chance to put his own stamp on something great. And put his stamp on it he did. Under David Mkin, The Simpsons changed. Not in a bad way, not in a way that broke what made the show special, but the tone shifted noticeably. The show got weirder. The comedy got more surreal, more unpredictable, and more willing to go to strange places that the previous showrunners might not have gone. And the biggest change was in who the show was really about. During the first couple of seasons, Bart had been the clear star. During the Gene and Reese years, the show had balanced its attention across the whole family and the wider world of Springfield. But under Mkin, the focus shifted heavily toward Homer Simpson. Homer became the engine that drove the show. His stupidity, his selfishness, his surprising moments of tenderness, and his ability to stumble into the most ridiculous situations imaginable became the core of what The Simpsons was about. Mkin understood something that would define the show for the rest of its run. Homer was the funniest character on the show, and the stories you could tell with him were almost limitless. A man who was dumb enough to get into any situation, but lovable enough that you always rooted for him anyway, was the perfect vehicle for comedy that could go anywhere. Mkin's very first writing credit on the show was for an episode called Deep Space Homer, which told the story of Homer being selected by NASA to go into space as part of a program designed to restore public interest in space exploration. The episode was a perfect example of Mkin's approach. It took a completely absurd premise and committed to it fully, playing the comedy big and broad, while still keeping the emotional core of the characters intact. Homer in space was ridiculous, but it worked because the show treated it with just enough sincerity to make you buy into the story while laughing at every turn. The episodes that came out of Mkin's 2 seasons are packed with fan favorites. Season 5 gave us Cape Fear, a brilliant parody of the film Cape Fear, in which Sideshow Bob stalks and terrorizes Bart. The episode featured one of the most famous gags in Simpsons history, with Sideshow Bob stepping on a series of rakes and getting hit in the face over and over again. The scene went on far longer than any normal joke would, past the point of being funny, through the awkward silence, and then back around to being funny again simply because of how long it lasted. It became one of the most quoted and referenced moments in the entire series. Springfield, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Legalized Gambling, explored what happened when Springfield opened a casino, with Homer becoming a blackjack dealer and Marge developing a gambling addiction. It was one of those episodes that managed to be both incredibly funny and surprisingly dark at the same time. Marge's spiral into compulsive gambling was played for laughs in many scenes, but there were moments where the show let you feel the real damage it was doing to her family. And those moments landed hard, because the comedy had earned your trust. Season 5 also included the show's 100th episode, Sweet Seymour Skinner's Badass Song, which focused on Principal Skinner getting fired from Springfield Elementary. And it featured several Treehouse of Horror segments that fans consider among the best in the series. Mkin also developed some of the show's secondary characters in ways that expanded the world of Springfield significantly. Apu Nahasapima, the Quickie Mart clerk, received more attention and deeper storylines under Mkin's watch. The supporting cast of Springfield, which had always been one of the show's strengths, became even richer and more detailed. But perhaps the most defining characteristic of Mkin's time on the show was his attitude towards censorship and network interference. He hated it. He fought against it at every opportunity, and he was not subtle about it. One of the clearest examples of this was his approach to Treehouse of Horror 5, the annual Halloween special. Mkin deliberately packed the episode with as much blood, violence, and dark content as he possibly could. His goal was to push back against the Fox censors as hard as he could. He told the post-production team to simply ignore the list of changes that Fox's Standards and Practices department sent over. He wanted to put out the most extreme version of the episode he could get away with, and he largely succeeded. Treehouse of Horror 5 is often cited by fans as one of the best Halloween specials the show ever produced, and Mkin's willingness to fight the censors was a big reason why. Mkin conducted the writing sessions differently from his predecessors as well. Instead of splitting the writers into 2 groups, which is what later showrunners would do, he kept everyone in one room. He often worked late into the night, pushing the scripts through rewrite after rewrite until they met his standards. Some writers found his style a bit demanding. Writer Brent Forrester described Mkin's leadership style as a little bit dictatorial, but the results spoke for themselves. The scripts that came out of that room were consistently excellent, and the writers who worked under Mkin, even the ones who found his style challenging, produced some of the best work of their careers during those 2 seasons. Season 6 pushed even further into bold territory. Sideshow Bob Roberts took on Republican politics and voter fraud. Homer Badman tackled sexual harassment and media sensationalism. Bart vs. Australia sent the Simpson family to a foreign country for the first time and sparked actual controversy when some Australian viewers felt the episode was mocking their country. The Simpsons staff received over 100 letters from Australians who were insulted by the episode, even though Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, who wrote it, had chosen Australia specifically because they thought Australians would have a good sense of humor about the jokes. The episode also highlighted a key part of what made the show during this era so exciting. It was willing to go places that made people uncomfortable, and it did so with enough intelligence and enough humor that the comedy always outweighed the controversy. Mkin's era also produced one of the most emotional episodes of the show's entire run. Lisa's Wedding, a flash-forward episode that showed Lisa as an adult falling in love while studying in England, was beautiful in a way that proved the show could still reach deep emotional places even as the comedy was getting bigger and more absurd. Mkin himself considered it one of his favorite episodes. And then came the crown jewel of the Mkin era. The 2-part episode, Who Shot Mr. Burns, was one of the biggest events in Simpsons history and one of the biggest events in 1990s television, period. The idea had originally come from Matt Groening, and it was developed by the writing staff, particularly Oakley and Weinstein. Mr. Burns had done something so terrible that practically every character in Springfield had a reason to want him dead. The first part ended with Burns being shot by an unknown attacker, and the show turned it into a massive mystery. Fox promoted it as a real event, encouraging viewers to guess who the shooter was. There was even a contest tied to the mystery. The question of who actually shot Mr. Burns was debated heavily in the writers' room. Oakley and Weinstein had pitched Barney Gumble as the culprit because they thought it could change the dynamic of the show by sending a regular character to jail. But Mkin pushed for Maggie Simpson as the shooter. He felt it was funnier and wanted the culprit to be a member of the Simpson family. There was some back and forth about it, but ultimately Mkin's suggestion won out. The second part of the episode revealed that Maggie had shot Burns, though the show was careful to make it ambiguous enough that it was not entirely clear whether it was an accident or intentional. Maggie's eyes shifted at the end of the reveal, and the episode left the audience with just enough doubt to keep them talking. Who Shot Mr. Burns was a cultural moment. It was the kind of television event that got people who did not normally watch The Simpsons talking about The Simpsons. It was the show at the peak of its cultural power, producing episodes that were not just great television, but genuine events that the whole country participated in. After season 6, David Mkin stepped down as showrunner, but he did not leave the show entirely. He stayed on in an advisory role, helping the next showrunners with technical aspects of the production like editing and sound mixing. He continued to attend table readings of scripts and remained a presence on the show for years to come. He also produced several episodes after leaving the showrunner chair, including Lisa the Vegetarian in season 7, an episode he championed because he had recently become a vegetarian himself. He flew to London to record the episode's guest stars, Paul and Linda McCartney, at Paul's recording studio. Mkin later said that recording with the McCartneys was one of the most amazing experiences of his life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Before stepping down, Mkin did one more thing that would shape the future of the show. He recommended that Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, the two writers who had survived the great staff departure after season 4 and had written some of the best episodes of seasons 5 and 6, should take over as the next showrunners. Mkin had watched them grow as writers during his 2 years running the show, and he believed they were ready. It was the right call. Because what Oakley and Weinstein were about to do with The Simpsons would give the Golden Age its final and perhaps most brilliant chapter, one that combined everything the show had been up to that point into something that many fans believe has never been topped. Section 6. The Final Golden Years. Oakley, Weinstein, and the End of an Era. Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein did not meet in a writer's room or at a comedy festival or through some Hollywood connection. They met in 8th grade. They became best friends as teenagers and started making comedy together before either of them was old enough to drive. They founded a humor magazine in high school and spent their teenage years figuring out how to make people laugh as a team. Oakley went on to attend Harvard University, where he became vice president of the Harvard Lampoon, the famous college humor magazine that had produced generations of comedy writers before him. Weinstein pursued his own path, but the two of them never stopped working together. They had been a team since they were kids, and that partnership would carry them all the way to running the most important animated show in television history. But getting there was not easy. After college, both Oakley and Weinstein struggled to find steady work in the entertainment industry. They bounced around, taking whatever jobs they could get. Oakley did some writing for a variety show called Sunday Best, but after that ended, he was unemployed for a long stretch. The comedy business is brutal, and even talented people can spend years waiting for their break. For Oakley and Weinstein, that break came in the form of a spec script. A spec script is a sample episode that a writer creates for an existing show, not because they have been hired to write it, but to prove that they can. Oakley and Weinstein wrote a spec script for Seinfeld, and it was good enough to catch the attention of Al Jean and Mike Reiss, who were running The Simpsons at the time. Jean and Reiss brought the two of them onto the show's writing staff in season 3, which began in 1991. Their first produced episode was Marge Gets a Job. From that point on, Oakley and Weinstein threw themselves into the show completely. They wrote episodes during season 3 and continued through the transition when David Mkin took over as showrunner for season 5. In fact, when Jean and Reiss left and most of the original writing staff departed with them, Oakley and Weinstein were among the only writers who stayed. Along with Conan O'Brien and Dan McGrath, they were the skeleton crew that kept things going while the show waited for its new showrunner to arrive. Before Mkin even started, Oakley, Weinstein, O'Brien, and McGrath spent a month mapping out most of the episodes for season 5 on their own. They were holding the show together during one of the most vulnerable moments in its history. Over the next 2 seasons under Mkin, Oakley and Weinstein continued to grow as writers. They penned some of the strongest episodes of the Mkin era. For season 5, they wrote Springfield, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Legalized Gambling, Lisa versus Malibu Stacy, the 100th episode, Sweet Seymour Skinner's Badass Song, and the Terror at 5.5 Feet segment of Treehouse of Horror 4. For season 6, they wrote Sideshow Bob Roberts, a sharp political satire based heavily on the Watergate scandal, which the two of them had a great interest in. They also wrote Grandpa versus Sexual Inadequacy, and Bart versus Australia, the episode that sent the Simpson family overseas and generated over 100 complaint letters from Australian viewers who felt the episode was mocking their country. And most famously, they wrote both parts of Who Shot Mr. Burns, the massive 2-part mystery that became one of the biggest television events of the 1990s. By the end of season 6, Mkin was ready to step down, and he knew exactly who should take over. He recommended Oakley and Weinstein for the job, and the two friends from 8th grade were appointed as the executive producers and showrunners of The Simpsons, starting with season 7. They were in their late 20s. They had been writing for the show since season 3. They had survived the great staff turnover, learned from 2 different showrunners, and written some of the most acclaimed episodes in the show's run. They were ready. But Oakley and Weinstein did not want to simply continue doing what Mkin had been doing. They had their own vision for the show, and it involved pulling back from some of the wilder, more surreal directions that the Mkin era had embraced. Their goal was to bring the focus back to the Simpson family. While Mkin, and to some extent Gene and Reese before him, had expanded the world of Springfield and devoted many memorable episodes to side characters and guest stars, Oakley and Weinstein wanted to turn the attention back to Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie. They wanted to tell stories rooted in the relationships between the 5 members of this family. They wanted episodes that felt grounded and real, even when they were funny and absurd. They wanted to explore what these characters felt about each other. The inspiration for their approach came from the era they admired most. Oakley and Weinstein idolized season 3, the first season that Gene and Reese had run. They saw that season as the perfect balance of comedy, emotion, and character depth, and they wanted to recapture that spirit while also bringing their own sensibility to the table. They were not trying to copy what Gene and Reese had done. They were trying to build on it, combining the grounded family focus of the early show with the bigger, bolder comedy that Mkin had introduced, and adding their own experimental edge on top of all of it. The way they managed the writer's room reflected the scale of what they were trying to do. Oakley and Weinstein often set 2 script rewriting rooms in motion at the same time, with each room working on a different episode simultaneously. They delegated leadership in these rooms to trusted writers like Steve Tompkins and David Cohen. Running 2 rooms at once was a demanding way to operate, but it allowed them to maintain the quality across more episodes and keep the production schedule on track. Mkin, who had stepped into an advisory role after recommending them for the job, stayed on to help with technical aspects of the show like editing and sound mixing. Having their former boss available as a resource gave Oakley and Weinstein a safety net during the transition, and it showed a level of generosity and teamwork behind the scenes that is not always common in the television business. The episodes that came out of seasons 7 and 8 are a remarkable collection. They represent what many fans and critics consider the absolute peak of The Simpsons, the final stretch of the golden age, where every different thing the show had ever been came together into one incredibly diverse but unified whole. Mother Simpson from season 7 is one of the most emotionally powerful episodes in the entire series. It revealed that Homer's mother, Mona Simpson, was not dead as he had believed his entire life. She had actually been on the run from the law for decades after participating in an act of activism against Mr. Burns' germ warfare laboratory back in the 1960s. The episode explored Homer's feelings about growing up without a mother, the pain of being abandoned even for a good reason, and the bittersweet reality of reconnecting with someone you lost a long time ago. The final scene, in which Homer sits alone on the hood of his car staring up at the night sky after his mother has to leave again, is one of the most famous and moving moments in Simpsons history. There is no joke at the end, no punchline, just Homer, alone, looking at the stars. Bill Oakley later said he regretted not submitting this episode for the Emmy Award that year, believing it would have had a strong chance of winning. Bart Sells His Soul tackled something surprisingly deep for a cartoon comedy. Bart, in a moment of careless bravado, sells his soul to Milhouse for $5. At first he treats it as a joke, but as the episode goes on, he starts to notice that something feels wrong. He cannot laugh at things that used to make him laugh. Automatic doors do not open for him. Animals seem to sense that something is missing. The episode played the concept of losing your soul both for comedy and for genuine unease, and it worked beautifully on both levels. 22 Short Films About Springfield was one of the most experimental episodes the show had ever attempted. Instead of following a single storyline, the episode jumped between dozens of short vignettes featuring different Springfield residents going about their day. It showed the town as a living, breathing place, full of people with their own lives, problems, and funny little moments. The episode was a direct reference to the film Pulp Fiction and other anthology-style storytelling, and it demonstrated that The Simpsons could break its own format and still deliver something brilliant. You Only Move Twice from Season 8 is consistently ranked as one of the best episodes ever made. The Simpson family moves to a new town when Homer gets a dream job working for a man named Hank Scorpio, who turns out to be a supervillain in the style of a James Bond antagonist. The genius of the episode is that Homer has no idea his boss is a villain. To Homer, Scorpio is just the best boss he has ever had, a friendly, energetic guy who gives him good benefits and actually cares about his employees. The contrast between Homer's clueless happiness and the global chaos happening around him is comedy at its finest, and Hank Scorpio became one of the most beloved one-time characters in the show's history. Homer's enemy took a completely different approach. It introduced Frank Grimes, a man who had worked hard his entire life, overcome terrible circumstances, and earned everything he had through honest effort. When Grimes arrives at the Springfield nuclear power plant and meets Homer, he is horrified. Here is a man who is lazy, incompetent, and stupid, and yet Homer has a house, a loving family, a steady job, and friends who adore him. Grimes cannot understand how someone like Homer can succeed in life, while people who actually try have to struggle for everything. The episode held up a mirror to the entire premise of the show and asked a question that the audience had been politely ignoring for years. How does Homer Simpson get away with it? The answer, delivered through Grimes' escalating breakdown, was both hilarious and deeply uncomfortable. Frank Grimes only appeared in one episode, but he became one of the most talked about and remembered characters in the entire series. Marge Be Not Proud told a smaller, quieter story about Bart shoplifting a video game and the strain it puts on his relationship with Marge. It was the kind of episode that showed the Oakley and Weinstein era at its most emotionally honest. No big gimmicks, no wild premises, just a mother and son dealing with a moment of broken trust, handled with care and humor in equal measure. Across these 2 seasons, Oakley and Weinstein managed to combine everything. The down-to-earth family stories of the show's earliest years, the deep character work and emotional weight that Gene and Reese had brought, the bold, absurd comedy that Mkin had championed, and their own willingness to experiment with form and push the boundaries of what a Simpsons episode could be. The result was 2 seasons that represented every shade of what The Simpsons was capable of, all working together in harmony. But by the end of Season 8, Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein were done. Not done with their careers, but done with The Simpsons. They later admitted in commentary recordings that by the end of their 2nd season as showrunners, they were so creatively and physically exhausted that there was no way they could have continued making episodes at that level of quality. They had poured everything they had into those 2 seasons, and they knew it was time to stop. It was the same decision that Gene and Reese had made, and that Mkin had made before them. 2 seasons seemed to be the limit. 2 seasons of running The Simpsons at full intensity was enough to leave even the most talented showrunners completely spent. Oakley and Weinstein stepped down after Season 8, and with their departure, something shifted. The Golden Age, that extraordinary stretch of television that had begun with Gene and Reese in Season 3, and had been carried through by Mkin and then Oakley and Weinstein through Season 8, was over. 6 seasons of the best comedy writing American television had ever seen. 6 seasons that had produced hundreds of classic episodes, launched careers, influenced an entire generation of comedy writers, and set a standard that the show itself would spend the rest of its life trying to live up to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What came next was a new chapter for The Simpsons, led by a new showrunner named Mike Scully, and his time at the helm would spark one of the most passionate and longest-running debates in the entire history of television fandom. A debate about whether the show fans loved had started to change into something else entirely. Section 7. The Mike Scully Era and the Great Divide. Every television show that runs long enough will eventually reach a point where the fans start to argue about when it stopped being as good as it used to be. For some shows, that moment is obvious. A beloved character leaves, or the writing takes a sharp turn, or something happens that everyone can point to and say, that is where things changed. For The Simpsons, that moment is not nearly as clean or as simple. The debate over when The Simpsons started to decline is one of the longest running arguments in the history of television fandom, and it has been going on for over 25 years with no sign of stopping. But if you ask most fans to name the era where the shift began, a large number of them will point to the same period, seasons 9 through 12, the Mike Scully years. Now, before we go any further, it is important to understand something. Saying that The Simpsons declined during this period does not mean the show became bad overnight. It does not mean that Mike Scully ruined the show, or that there were no good episodes during his time as showrunner. The reality is much more complicated than that. The Scully era produced some genuinely great television, but it also represented a shift in tone, in style, and in what the show seemed to care about. And that shift was noticeable enough that it became the dividing line for a generation of fans who had grown up watching what many consider the greatest comedy ever made. Mike Scully took over as showrunner starting with the 9th production season. Season 9 actually contained a mix of episodes from different showrunners. 3 episodes were holdovers from Season 8 that Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein had produced. 2 more had been run by David Mkin, who returned to produce a couple of episodes. And another 2 holdover episodes had been produced by Al Jean and Mike Reiss, who came back briefly to work on the show during this transitional period. So the aired 9th season was a patchwork of different creative voices, which made the transition less abrupt than it might have been otherwise. But as Scully's own episodes began to fill the schedule, the change in direction became clear. The most significant shift under Scully was in the show's approach to comedy. During the Golden Age, The Simpsons had always balanced its humor with emotional depth. The jokes were sharp and plentiful, but they existed within stories that cared about the characters and their relationships. Homer could be stupid and selfish, but he was also a man who loved his family and occasionally showed surprising depth. Bart could be a troublemaker, but he was also a 10-year-old kid dealing with real feelings. The comedy grew out of the characters and their situations. Under Scully, the balance tilted. The show moved toward a style that favored more gags per minute, bigger and more outlandish storylines, and a faster pace that sometimes came at the expense of the quieter, more grounded moments that had defined the Golden Age. Homer, in particular, began to change. During seasons 3 through 8, Homer's stupidity had always existed within certain boundaries. He was dumb, yes, but he was dumb in a way that felt human. He made mistakes that real people could relate to, even if they were exaggerated for comedy. Under Scully, Homer started to become more cartoonish. His behavior became more extreme, more reckless, and sometimes more mean-spirited. The line between Homer as a lovable fool and Homer as someone who is genuinely difficult to root for started to blur. Chris Suellentrop, a critic writing for Slate, put it directly when he described what happened to the show under Scully's watch. He wrote that The Simpsons had become, well, a cartoon. He pointed out that episodes that once would have ended with Homer and Marge riding bicycles into the sunset now ended with Homer blowing a tranquilizer dart into Marge's neck. The comedy was still there, but the heart that had always accompanied it was harder to find. This shift was not something that Scully was necessarily unaware of. When asked in 2007 about how the show maintained its longevity, he gave an answer that was equal parts honest and darkly funny. He joked that the secret was to lower your quality standards, and once you had done that, you could go on forever. It was clearly a joke, but it was the kind of joke that landed differently depending on how you felt about what had happened to the show during his time in charge. But here is where the debate gets more complicated, because the argument that the show fell apart under Mike Scully is not as airtight as some fans want it to be. The ratings during the Scully era were actually around the same level as they had been during the Golden Age. People were still watching. The show was still pulling in large audiences on a weekly basis. And there were genuine highlights scattered throughout these 4 seasons that showed the show could still deliver at a high level when everything clicked. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson, which aired early in Season 9, is widely considered one of the best episodes of the entire series. It followed the Simpson family on a trip to New York City, where Homer had to retrieve his car, which had been illegally parked at the base of the World Trade Center by Barney Gumble. The episode was a brilliantly funny look at the chaos and excitement of New York through the eyes of a man who hated every second of being there, while the rest of his family had the time of their lives exploring the city. It was classic Simpsons in every way, and it showed that the show was still capable of producing all-time great episodes, even as the overall tone was shifting. Season 9 also won 3 Emmy Awards. Trash of the Titans took the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, which was a significant achievement. Hank Azaria won the Emmy for Outstanding Voiceover Performance for his portrayal of Apu Nahasapeemapetalon. And composer Alf Clausen, along with writer Ken Keeler, won the Emmy for Outstanding Music and Lyrics. These were not the awards of a show that had completely lost its way. They were signs that even during a period of transition, The Simpsons could still produce work that the industry recognized as excellent. But the Scully era was also marked by a tragedy that had nothing to do with writing quality or creative direction. On May 28, 1998, Phil Hartman was killed. Hartman had been one of the most beloved recurring guest performers on The Simpsons. He voiced 2 characters who had become fan favorites over the years. Troy McClure was a washed-up actor who introduced himself with the unforgettable line, "Hi, I'm Troy McClure. You may remember me from such films as," followed by whatever ridiculous fake movie title the writers had come up with that week. Lionel Hutz was an incompetent lawyer who took on any case no matter how hopeless, and whose business card famously listed his name as, "Works on contingency? No, money down!" Both characters were hilarious, both were deeply loved by fans, and both were brought to life entirely by Hartman's incredible voice acting talent. When Hartman died, the people behind The Simpsons made a decision that said a lot about how they felt about the man and his contributions to the show. They retired both Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz. They did not recast the characters with new voice actors. They did not try to replace Hartman. They simply stopped using the characters out of respect. Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz faded from the show, and while Hutz occasionally appeared in the background of crowd scenes in later years, he was never given lines or featured as a character again. It was a quiet, dignified tribute, and it set a precedent that the show would follow again years later when other voice actors passed away. The Scully era also saw the first major salary disputes between the voice cast and Fox. Until 1998, the 6 main voice actors on the show, Dan Castellaneta, Julie Kavner, Nancy Cartwright, Yardley Smith, Hank Azaria, and Harry Shearer, had all been locked into contracts paying them $30,000 per episode. That was the rate they had been earning since the show began in 1989. Think about that for a moment. For nearly the entire Golden Age, the actors voicing the most famous characters in American animation were earning $30,000 per episode. That is a solid paycheck, but for a show that was generating billions of dollars in merchandise and advertising revenue, it was remarkably low. In 1998, the cast wanted more money, and Fox did not want to pay it. The negotiations got ugly. Fox actually threatened to replace all 6 main voice actors with entirely new performers. The network went as far as preparing to hold auditions for new voices. It was a shocking move, and the idea of hearing someone other than Dan Castellaneta voice Homer Simpson or someone other than Nancy Cartwright voice Bart was horrifying to fans. The dispute was eventually resolved, and the cast received a raise to $125,000 per episode. It was a significant increase, but it was still just a fraction of what the show was worth. These salary battles would continue for years, with the numbers climbing higher each time. But that 1998 dispute was the first time the public became aware of just how contentious the business side of The Simpsons could be. During these years, the show also reached several milestones that underscored just how long it had been on the air. The 200th episode, Trash of the Titans, aired in Season 9. The 250th episode came during Season 12. These were numbers that very few shows in television history had ever reached, and The Simpsons was hitting them while still being a relevant part of the cultural conversation, even if the nature of that conversation was increasingly about weather. The show was as good as it used to be. The behind-the-scenes dynamics during the Scully era were also worth noting. While Scully was the showrunner and bore the responsibility for the overall direction of the show, the reality of making The Simpsons was always a collaborative process. The writing staff, the animators, the voice actors, and the producers all contributed to what the show became in any given season. Scully was generally well regarded by the writers who worked under him. He was described as one of the best bosses many of them had ever had, someone who was supportive, encouraging, and easy to work with. The criticism of his era tends to focus on the creative output rather than on Scully as a person or a leader. He was liked and respected within the Simpsons offices, even by people who felt the show's direction was not quite right. The question of why the show changed under Scully is complicated, and it probably does not have a single answer. Part of it was inevitable. By Season 9, The Simpsons had been running for nearly a decade. The writers had already explored the most obvious and most natural stories for these characters. Homer's relationship with Marge, Bart's rebellion, Lisa's intelligence, the dynamics between the family members, the quirks of Springfield's residents, all of these things had been mined extensively during the Golden Age. Finding fresh stories that felt as natural and as emotionally true as the classics was getting harder simply because so much ground had already been covered. When you have already written some of the best episodes in television history about a character's relationship with his wife, his kids, his boss, and his town, where do you go next? For many shows, the answer is to go bigger, go wilder, and push the stories further out from the core. And that is largely what happened. Part of it was also about the loss of talent. The Simpsons had been built by an extraordinary collection of writers, and many of the best ones had moved on by the time Scully took over. Oakley and Weinstein were gone. Gene and Reese had left years earlier. Conan O'Brien was hosting a talk show. The writers who replaced them were talented in their own right, but replacing the specific group of people who had created the Golden Age was an impossible task. The magic of those earlier seasons was not just about any one writer or any one showrunner. It was about a specific combination of people working together at a specific moment in time, and that combination could not be recreated once the people were gone. And part of it was simply the weight of expectations. Every episode that aired during the Scully era was being measured against some of the greatest television ever produced. Even good episodes felt disappointing when they were being compared to Last Exit to Springfield or Mother Simpson or You Only Move Twice. The bar had been set so impossibly high during the Golden Age that anything short of perfection felt like a letdown to the fans who had been watching since the beginning. Mike Scully stepped down as showrunner after Season 12, which aired during the 2000 to 2001 television season. His 4 seasons at the helm had been productive, controversial, and defined by a debate that would never really end. The show was still on the air. It was still pulling in viewers. It was still capable of moments of brilliance. But something had shifted, and most fans could feel it, even if they could not always explain exactly what it was. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What came next was a return. A familiar face coming back to take the reins of the show he had helped build over a decade earlier. Al Jean, the man who had co-run the Golden Age alongside Mike Reese, was coming home. And he would stay for a very, very long time, guiding The Simpsons through some of its biggest moments, its greatest challenges, and the single most ambitious project in the show's history. a feature-length movie that had been talked about for years and was finally about to become real. Section 8. Mkin Returns and the Long Reign. There's something poetic about the way The Simpsons handled its leadership after the Mike Scully years. The show did not go looking for someone new, someone from outside, someone with a fresh perspective who had never worked on the series before. Instead, it reached back into its own history and pulled out the man who had helped build the Golden Age in the first place. Mkin, who had co-run seasons 3 and 4 alongside Mike Reiss and had been one of the very first writers hired for the original staff back in 1989, came back to take the showrunner chair on his own. And this time, he was not coming back for 2 seasons. He was coming back for over 20 years. His return marked the beginning of the longest single stretch of leadership in the show's history, and it would see The Simpsons through some of the most important moments it would ever experience, including the one thing fans had been asking about for over a decade: a movie. Gene had never fully left The Simpsons' orbit. After he and Reiss stepped down as showrunners following season 4, they went off to create The Critic, which lasted 2 seasons before being canceled. After that, Gene and Reiss signed a 3-year development deal with the Walt Disney Company to produce television shows for ABC. They pitched multiple ideas, but the only project that actually made it to air was a live-action sitcom called Teen Angel, which was canceled in its first season. After that, the writing partnership between Gene and Reiss effectively ended. They stopped collaborating on new projects together, and their careers went in different directions. Gene came back to The Simpsons on his own during the 10th season, returning as a writer and producer while Mike Scully was still running the show. He spent 3 seasons working under Scully, contributing to episodes and reacquainting himself with a show that had changed quite a bit since his Golden Age days. When Scully stepped down after season 12, Gene was the natural choice to take over. He became the sole showrunner, starting with season 13 in 2001, and Mike Reiss returned on a part-time basis as a consultant and producer. Reiss would fly to Los Angeles 1 day a week to attend story meetings and contribute to the writing process. But the day-to-day responsibility for the show belonged entirely to Gene. Gene described the job as a great job with a lot of responsibility, and acknowledged that the love people had for The Simpsons was both the best and the hardest part. The best because it meant the show mattered to millions of people around the world. The hardest because those same people had incredibly high expectations, and living up to them after the Golden Age was a challenge that never went away. Gene was honest about the biggest obstacle he faced: coming up with fresh ideas. After more than a decade on the air, the show had covered an enormous amount of ground. Finding new stories that felt original and exciting for characters who had already been through hundreds of episodes was a constant struggle. Under Gene's leadership, the show settled into what many observers described as a more consistent but less adventurous mode. The wild swings of the Mkin era and the experimental boldness of the Oakley and Weinstein years gave way to a steadier, more predictable approach. Episodes were well crafted and professionally executed, but they rarely surprised audiences the way the Golden Age episodes had. Former writers who had worked on the show during its peak years were not always kind in their assessments. Some complained that the show under Gene felt like it was, quote, on autopilot. Others said it had become, quote, too sentimental. One former writer described the episodes as, quote, just being cranked out, suggesting that the creative fire that had driven the show's, quote, best work had cooled into something more mechanical. These criticisms were not universal, and there were plenty of people both inside and outside the show who felt that Gene was doing the best anyone could with a series that had been running for so long. Keeping The Simpsons on the air and functioning at a professional level for decade after decade was an enormous achievement, regardless of how the later seasons compared to the Golden Age, and Gene's tenure was not without its highlights. There were individual episodes scattered throughout his long run that showed flashes of the old brilliance. Moments where the writing clicked and the characters felt as alive and funny as they ever had. But the overall trajectory was one of slow, steady decline in the eyes of many longtime fans and critics. The show was no longer appointment television the way it had been in the 1990s. It was still on the air, still watched, still part of the culture, but it had shifted from being something people were passionate about to something people were comfortable with. None of that, however, diminishes what Al Jean accomplished during the biggest project of his entire career. The Simpsons movie had been talked about for years. Almost from the moment the show became a hit in the early 1990s, people had been asking when there would be a feature-length film. James L. Brooks himself had thought about it early on. He originally believed that the Season 4 episode Camp Krusty had a story that could work as a movie, but he ran into difficulties trying to stretch the script to the length needed for a feature film. For over a decade, the movie remained in the someday category. The creators had long said that a Simpsons movie would not go into production until after the series had finished, because making a movie while also producing a weekly television show was an enormous amount of work. But as the years went on and the show kept getting renewed with no end in sight, it became clear that waiting for the series to end might mean waiting forever. So they decided to do both at the same time. Production of The Simpsons movie happened alongside the continued writing and production of the regular television series. The film was produced by Gracie Films for 20th Century Fox, and it brought together a team of writers that read like a reunion of the show's greatest era. The screenplay was written by 11 of the most prolific writers in Simpsons history: Matt Groening, James L. Brooks, Al Jean, Mike Reiss, Mike Scully, David Mkin, Matt Selman, Ian Maxtone Graham, George Meyer, John Swartzwelder, and John Vitti all contributed to the script. Having that many legendary Simpsons writers in one room working on a single project was something that had not happened since the early days of the show. The film was directed by David Silverman, who had been with The Simpsons since the very beginning. Silverman was one of the original 3 animators who had worked on the Tracy Ullman shorts back in 1987. He had been the show's supervising director for years, and he understood the visual language of The Simpsons better than almost anyone alive. The story of the movie centered on Homer doing what Homer does best, making a terrible decision and then having to deal with the consequences. After a concert on Lake Springfield by the rock band Green Day ends in disaster when the polluted lake dissolves their barge, Lisa Simpson leads a campaign to clean up the water. The town responds and the lake is restored to a clean state. But Homer has adopted a pig from Krusty Burger, a pig he lovingly names Spider Pig, and within just 2 days, the pig's waste has filled an entire silo. When Homer cannot be bothered to dispose of the silo properly, he dumps it directly into the freshly cleaned lake, instantly polluting it beyond anything the town has ever seen. The contamination catches the attention of Russ Cargill, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, voiced by Albert Brooks, who had previously guest starred on the show as the memorable villain Hank Scorpio in You Only Move Twice. Cargill presents President Arnold Schwarzenegger with 5 options for dealing with Springfield's pollution crisis. Schwarzenegger, who declares that he was elected to lead, not to read, randomly picks option 3 without looking at any of them. Option 3 is to seal Springfield off from the rest of the world under a gigantic glass dome. The entire town is trapped. When the citizens discover that Homer is responsible for the crisis, they form an angry mob and march on the Simpson house. The family escapes through a sinkhole that Maggie discovers in her sandbox and flees to Alaska, where they try to start a new life. But the crisis back in Springfield escalates. Cargill convinces Schwarzenegger to destroy the town entirely, and it falls on Homer to overcome his selfishness, return to Springfield, and save the people who want to kill him. Marge and the kids, furious with Homer for his refusal to take responsibility, leave him and return to Springfield on their own. Homer's journey back to save his family and his town is the emotional core of the movie, and it works because it is built on the same dynamic that has driven the show since the very beginning. Homer is a deeply flawed man who often puts himself first, but when the people he loves are in danger, he finds a way to step up. Even if his way of stepping up involves a motorcycle, a bomb, and a very large dome. The Spider Pig gag, in which Homer sings a parody of the Spider-Man theme song while walking his pig across the ceiling, became one of the most memorable moments from the film and one of the most quoted lines of 2007. The song was actually a late addition to the script, added during the final stages of production after test screenings. The film itself went through numerous changes during its development. Early brainstorming sessions included a pitch from Mike Scully, where Steven Spielberg would try to blow up Springfield to film a movie with Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks ended up making a guest appearance in the finished film, voicing himself. Matt Groening introduced the idea of Homer adopting a pig after reading a news story about pig waste management. There was also a concept similar to The Truman Show, where the characters would discover their lives were actually a television series. But Groening rejected that idea because he felt the Simpsons should never become aware of themselves as celebrities. That concept was later used in the 2007 video game The Simpsons Game instead. The film had preview screenings in Portland, Oregon and Phoenix, Arizona in March 2007, and the feedback led to significant changes. Audiences found some of Homer's behavior too unlikable, so several scenes were toned down to make him more sympathetic. A scene where Kang and Kodos criticized the film during the end credits was removed. The villain Russ Cargill was redesigned multiple times, with Albert Brooks originally basing the character's speech patterns on Donald Rumsfeld before the character was reworked into a younger design. Fox held a competition among 16 towns named Springfield across the United States to determine which one would host the American premiere. Each Springfield produced a short film explaining why their town deserved the honor, and the public voted on the USA Today website. Springfield, Vermont won the competition, beating Springfield, Illinois by a margin of 15,367 votes to 14,634. The premiere was held there on July 21, 2007, and the film was released nationwide 6 days later on July 27th. The promotional campaign for the movie was massive. In one of the most creative marketing tie-ins in film history, 12 7-Eleven stores across the United States were transformed into real-life Quickie Marts, complete with Squishies, Krusty O's cereal, and Duff Beer energy drinks. The promotion was a huge hit and generated enormous buzz in the weeks leading up to the film's release. The Simpsons movie was a commercial success by any measure. It was made on a production budget of $75 million and grossed $536.4 million worldwide. It opened at number 1 on its opening weekend with a domestic gross of over $74 million. It became the 8th highest grossing film of 2007 and at the time was the highest grossing film ever made based on an animated television series. It also became the second highest grossing traditionally animated film behind The Lion King, a record it held for years. Critics responded positively as well. The film earned an 88% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with the consensus praising its humor, heart, and faithfulness to the source material. It was nominated for a Golden Globe Award for Best Animated Feature Film at the 65th Golden Globe Awards. For a show that many people had been writing off for years, the movie proved that The Simpsons still had the ability to connect with a massive audience when the right talent was assembled and the stakes were high enough. The success of the movie was a validation of everything Al Jean had been doing during his long tenure as showrunner. He had kept the show alive and functioning for years, maintained the relationships with the writers and voice actors and producers that made the operation work, and then delivered a feature film that reminded the world why The Simpsons mattered in the first place. It was not a perfect film, and some critics noted that it felt more like an extended episode than a true cinematic experience. But it worked. It made people laugh, it made people feel things, and it made over $500 million. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But even as the Simpsons movie was bringing the franchise back into the global spotlight, the show itself was about to go through one of the most dramatic visual transformations in its history. After nearly 20 years of looking the same way, The Simpsons was about to change how it appeared on screen in a way that every single viewer would immediately notice. And the debate over whether that change was for better or worse would rage for years to come. Section 9. The HD Revolution and a New Visual Identity. For almost 20 years, The Simpsons looked the same. The colors, the shapes, the way the characters moved across the screen, the size and format of the picture on your television, all of it had remained remarkably consistent since the show first premiered in December 1989. The animation had gotten cleaner and more polished over the years, gradually improving from the rough, wobbly look of the early seasons into something smoother and more refined. But the fundamental visual identity of the show had stayed the same. If you watched an episode from Season 1 and then watched an episode from Season 18, you could see the improvement in quality, but the show still felt like the same show. It still had the same warmth, the same hand-drawn character, the same slightly imperfect charm that came from real human beings drawing every single frame. And then, during Season 20, all of that changed. The Simpsons went through the most dramatic visual transformation in its entire history, and for better or worse, the show would never look the same again. To understand why this happened, you have to understand what was going on with television itself at the time. For decades, television shows had been produced and broadcast in what is called standard definition, with a 4:3 aspect ratio. What that means in simple terms is that the picture on your screen was almost square. It was slightly wider than it was tall, but not by much. That is what televisions looked like from the time they were invented all the way through the early 2000s. Every episode of The Simpsons from Season 1 through Season 19 and part of Season 20 was made to fit that almost square screen. But by the mid-2000s, television technology was changing fast. People were buying new televisions that were wider and flatter than the old ones. These new screens had a 16:9 aspect ratio, which means the picture was much wider compared to its height. It was shaped more like a movie screen. Along with the wider shape came high definition, which meant the picture was much sharper and more detailed than what standard definition could provide. By 2008 and 2009, these newer televisions were becoming the standard in homes across America and around the world. The old square screens were being thrown out or shoved into spare bedrooms, and the new wide screens were taking over living rooms everywhere. Television shows had to adapt. If a show kept producing episodes in the old square format, those episodes would either have black bars on the sides when played on a widescreen television, or the picture would be stretched and distorted to fill the wider space. Neither option was ideal. So one by one, television shows started making the switch. They began producing their episodes in the wider 16:9 format with high-definition picture quality. Other animated shows like American Dad made similar changes around the same time. For The Simpsons, a show that had been on the air since 1989, this was an enormous undertaking. It meant rethinking how every frame of animation was composed. It meant adjusting character designs, backgrounds, colors, and the overall look of the show to work on a wider canvas. The Simpsons officially began its transition to high definition with the premiere of Season 20. The episode Take My Life, Please aired on September 28, 2008, and marked the beginning of this new era. The full transition to the widescreen 16:9 format completed during the course of that season, with a changeover happening roughly midway through. From that point forward, every new episode of The Simpsons would be produced in high-definition widescreen. The differences were immediately visible. The most obvious change was the shape of the picture itself. Episodes now filled the entire width of a modern television screen, giving the animators a much broader field of view to work with. Where the old format had felt cozy and contained, the new format felt more open and expansive. Backgrounds could contain more detail. Crowd scenes could include more characters. The overall composition of each shot had more room to breathe. But the changes went far beyond just the shape of the screen. The color palette of the show shifted noticeably. The new high-definition episodes featured brighter and more saturated colors compared to the softer, warmer tones of the standard definition era. Everything popped more. The yellows were more vivid, the blues were sharper, the greens were more intense. The overall visual experience was cleaner and crisper in every way. The character designs received subtle updates as well. The lines were smoother and more precise. The characters looked more polished and more uniform from scene to scene. In the older episodes, there had always been slight variations in how characters were drawn from one frame to the next. Tiny imperfections that gave the animation a handmade quality. Those imperfections largely disappeared in the high-definition era. The animation became more consistent, more controlled, and more technically perfect. The way the show was actually made changed too. The Simpsons had started its life using traditional animation techniques. In the earliest seasons, the animation was done by hand. Real people drew every frame on paper or on animation cells, and those drawings were then photographed and assembled into the finished episode. Over the years, the production had gradually incorporated more and more digital tools. The first episode to use digital inking and painting was the Treehouse of Horror 13 segment in Season 14, which marked an early step away from the purely hand-drawn process. But the full transition to an entirely computer-assisted production pipeline did not happen until the move to high definition in Season 20. After the switch, the show used software like Toon Boom Harmony for animation and various digital tools for compositing and visual effects. The characters were still drawn, but they were now drawn on graphics tablets rather than on paper. The end result looked similar to hand-drawn animation in many ways, but the process behind it was fundamentally different. The warmth and slight roughness of the hand-drawn era was replaced by the precision and smoothness of digital production. Fan reaction to the change was split right down the middle. Some viewers loved the new look. They appreciated the sharper picture quality, the richer colors, and the more detailed backgrounds. They felt that the show looked modern and fresh, and that the upgrade brought The Simpsons into the current era of television production where it belonged. After nearly 20 years, the show deserved to look its best on the screens people were actually watching. Other fans mourned what had been lost. They felt that the hand-drawn look of the classic episodes was part of what made The Simpsons special. The slight imperfections, the softer colors, the warmth of the traditional animation process, all of these things had given the show a personality that went beyond just the writing and the voice acting. The old episodes felt like something a person had made. The new episodes, while technically superior, felt like something a machine had made. The soul of the animation, these fans argued, had been traded for shine. This debate would continue for years and is still going on today. There is no right answer. Both sides have valid points. The show needed to adapt to modern television technology or risk looking outdated on the screens where most people were watching. But the visual identity that had defined the show for 2 decades was genuinely altered in the process. And for viewers who had grown up with the classic look, that loss was real and meaningful. The transition to high definition also created an unexpected problem that would not fully surface until years later. All of those classic episodes from the first 19 seasons and part of season 20 had been produced in the old 4:3 square format. When the time came to remaster those episodes for modern viewing, a choice had to be made. The episodes could be presented in their original 4:3 format, which would mean black bars on the sides of a widescreen television. Or they could be cropped and reformatted to fit the wider 16:9 shape, which would fill the screen but would mean cutting off the top and bottom of the original picture. That choice would become a major controversy years later when all those classic episodes landed on a streaming service, but that is a story for a later section. Season 20 was significant for more than just the visual overhaul. It also marked the show's 20th anniversary, a milestone that very few television programs in history had ever reached. The Simpsons had been on the air for 2 full decades. It had survived multiple showrunner changes, the departure of nearly every member of its original writing staff, salary disputes that threatened to shut it down, the death of beloved performers, the rise and fall of Bart mania, the end of the golden age, and years of criticism from fans who said it was no longer as good as it used to be. And it was still going. Still producing new episodes every season, still pulling in viewers, still part of the American cultural landscape in a way that no other animated show had ever managed to be. The show's longevity was becoming its own kind of achievement. By season 20, The Simpsons had already broken the record for the longest-running American animated series, a record it had taken from the Flintstones years earlier. It was also closing in on the record for the longest-running American sitcom of any kind, animated or live action. These were records that seemed impossible when the show first premiered as a Christmas special in 1989. And the fact that The Simpsons was still standing while so many other shows had come and gone was a testament to the strength of its core concept and the dedication of the people who kept making it. But the 20th anniversary also brought with it a certain sadness for longtime fans. The show that was celebrating 20 years on the air was not the same show it had been during its peak. The Golden Age was more than a decade in the past. The writers who had created the classic episodes were scattered across the entertainment industry, working on other projects, running other shows, or retired from television entirely. The animation looked different. The humor felt different. The cultural conversation around The Simpsons had shifted from excitement and anticipation to nostalgia and debate. People still watched the show, but many of them watched it out of habit rather than passion. The Simpsons had become comfortable rather than essential, a show you left on in the background rather than one you planned your evening around. During this period, the show also lost another voice that had been part of its world for years. In October 2013, Marcia Wallace passed away from breast cancer. Wallace had voiced Edna Krabappel, the long-suffering teacher at Springfield Elementary who was known for her dry humor, her failed romances, and her relationship with Bart that swung between antagonism and genuine affection. Krabappel had been a recurring character since the very first season, and Wallace had brought her to life with a warmth and a weariness that made the character feel completely real. When Wallace died, Al Jean made the same decision that had been made after Phil Hartman's death years earlier. He retired the character of Edna Krabappel. She would not be recast with a new voice actor. She would not be replaced. She would simply be gone, and the show would honor her absence rather than try to fill it. It was the right call, and it showed a consistency in how the show treated its performers that went all the way back to the decision to retire Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz after Hartman's passing in 1998. The Simpsons had always valued the relationship between a character and the person who gave them their voice, and when that person was gone, the character went with them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The high-definition era of The Simpsons stretched on through the 2000s, with Al Jean continuing his remarkably long run as showrunner. The show kept producing episodes, kept reaching new milestones, and kept adding to its record-breaking episode count. But the world around the show was changing in ways that would reshape The Simpsons yet again. The rise of streaming services, the decline of traditional broadcast television, and a growing cultural conversation about representation and diversity in entertainment were all converging, and they would force The Simpsons to confront questions it had never had to face before about the voices behind its characters and who gets to play whom in an increasingly thoughtful world. Section 10. The Voice Acting Controversies and the Push for Representation. For most of its life, The Simpsons existed in a space where nobody really thought too hard about who was behind the microphone. The show had always used a small group of incredibly talented voice actors to play dozens and dozens of characters. Dan Castellaneta did not just voice Homer Simpson. He also voiced Barney Gumble, Grandpa Simpson, Krusty the Clown, Groundskeeper Willie, Mayor Quimby, and many others. Julie Kavner was not just Marge, she was also Marge's sisters Patty and Selma. Nancy Cartwright voiced Bart, but she also voiced Nelson Muntz, Ralph Wiggum, and other children. Harry Shearer played Mr. Burns, Waylon Smithers, Ned Flanders, Principal Skinner, Reverend Lovejoy, Kent Brockman, and a long list of other Springfield residents. And Hank Azaria was perhaps the most versatile of them all, voicing Moe Szyslak, Chief Wiggum, Comic Book Guy, Professor Frink, Snake, Dr. Nick, Superintendent Chalmers, and many more. Among Castellaneta, Shearer, and Azaria alone, they voiced the vast majority of the male characters in all of Springfield. This was how animated shows worked. Voice actors played whoever they were good at playing, regardless of whether the character matched the actor's own background. It was considered a demonstration of skill and range. The better you were at creating distinct voices, the more characters you could play, and the more valuable you were to the show. Nobody questioned it. For decades, it was simply how the business operated. And then, starting in 2017, the conversation changed. The spark came from a comedian named Hari Kondabolu. In 2017, Kondabolu released a documentary called The Problem with Apu. The film examined the character of Apu Nahasapima Petalan, the Indian immigrant who ran the Quickie Mart convenience store in Springfield. Apu had been a part of The Simpsons since the early seasons and was one of the show's most recognizable recurring characters. He was voiced by Hank Azaria, a white actor of Greek and Spanish descent, using an exaggerated Indian accent. Kondabolu's documentary argued that Apu was a harmful stereotype of South Asian people, and that for many Indian Americans and South Asian Americans, the character had been a source of real pain. The film featured interviews with South Asian actors, comedians, and public figures who talked about being mocked with Apu impressions growing up, being called Apu as an insult, and feeling like the character reduced their entire culture to a punchline about convenience stores and funny accents. The documentary hit a nerve. It sparked a national conversation about representation in animated shows, and about whether it was acceptable for white actors to voice characters of color. The discussion went far beyond just Apu. It raised questions about the entire tradition of cross-racial voice acting in animation, and whether practices that had been considered normal for decades were actually causing harm to real people. The Simpsons did not handle the initial response well. In the season 29 episode, No Good Read Goes Unpunished, which aired in April 2018, the show addressed the controversy directly, but in a way that many people found dismissive. In the episode, Marge reads a book from her childhood and realizes that it contains outdated and offensive content. She tries to revise it to make it more acceptable, but the changes strip the story of everything that made it interesting. The scene then cuts to Lisa, who looks directly at the camera and says that something that started decades ago and was applauded and inoffensive is now politically incorrect. She asks, "What can you do?" and then glances at a framed photograph of Apu sitting on her nightstand, inscribed with the words, "Don't have a cow." The message was clear. The show was acknowledging the criticism, but suggesting that there was no good solution and that people were overreacting. The response to that scene was overwhelmingly negative. Critics and viewers felt that the show had brushed off a legitimate concern with a shrug and a wink. Hari Kondabolu himself responded publicly, saying that his documentary was not made to get rid of a cartoon character, but to discuss race, representation, and his community. He said it was about how you can love something like The Simpsons and still be critical about aspects of it. The backlash to the show's dismissive response was arguably worse than the original controversy itself. But the conversation kept going, and it kept growing. In the months and years that followed, Hank Azaria began to publicly reckon with his role in the situation. He did not dig in or get defensive. Instead, he listened. He talked to South Asian people about their experiences with the character. He reflected on what the role had meant and what damage it might have caused. In an interview on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, Azaria said that the idea that anybody, young or old, past or present, was bullied or teased because of the character of Apu made him genuinely sad. He said it was certainly not his intention. He had wanted to spread laughter and joy with the character, and the idea that it had brought pain and suffering in any way, that it had been used to marginalize people, was upsetting to him. By 2020, Azaria had made his decision. He stepped away from voicing Apu, explaining that it just did not feel right anymore. He described the decision as mutual between himself and the show's producers. Matt Groening said publicly that he had big plans for Apu in 2021, suggesting that the character would continue with a new voice actor. But as the years passed, no replacement was announced, and Apu's appearances on the show became increasingly rare. The character was not officially killed off or written out, but he faded into the background in a way that left his future unclear. The decision about Apu was just the beginning of a broader change. In June 2020, in the wake of a nationwide reckoning about race and representation in American culture, The Simpsons made an official announcement. A Fox spokesman named Les Eisner released a statement saying that, moving forward, The Simpsons would no longer have white actors voice non-white characters. It was a sweeping policy change that affected multiple characters across the show. The most significant recastings happened over the following months. Kevin Michael Richardson, a black voice actor, took over the role of Dr. Julius Hibbert from Harry Shearer. Hibbert had been one of Springfield's most prominent black characters, the friendly family doctor known for his warm laugh and his resemblance to Bill Cosby's Cliff Huxtable character from The Cosby Show. Richardson stepped into the role starting in the season 32 episode, Diary Queen. Alex Desire, another black actor, replaced Hank Azaria as the voice of Carl Carlson, Homer's co-worker and best friend of Lenny Leonard at the Springfield Nuclear Power Plant. And Tony Rodriguez, a Cuban-American actor who is also gay, took over the role of Julio, a recurring character who is both Cuban and gay and had previously been voiced by Azaria. The show was making a deliberate effort to match the backgrounds of its voice actors with the backgrounds of the characters they were playing, at least for characters of color. Not everyone on the show agreed with the changes. Harry Shearer, who had played dozens of characters across the show's entire run, including Dr. Hibbert, made his feelings known in a 2020 interview on Times Radio. Shearer said he had a very simple belief about acting. The job of the actor, he said, is to play someone who they are not. It was a direct and clear statement of his position, and it reflected a view held by many people in the voice acting community who felt that the whole point of acting was to inhabit characters who were different from yourself. A spokesperson for Shearer later clarified that his comment was a general statement about the nature of acting, and that he did not have the life experiences of most characters he had ever played, whether on The Simpsons or anywhere else. The voice casting controversy was not the only behind-the-scenes drama involving the cast during this period. Back in 2015, Harry Shearer had briefly and very publicly left The Simpsons over a contract dispute. Shearer had always been the cast member most willing to criticize the network and the show's producers, and when negotiations for a new contract broke down before season 27, he announced he was leaving. The situation turned ugly fast. Producer Al Jean responded by saying the show would not retire Shearer's characters the way it had when Phil Hartman and Marsha Wallace died. Instead, Jean said, the show would simply recast the roles. The idea of someone other than Shearer voicing Mr. Burns, Ned Flanders, and Principal Skinner was horrifying to fans. The standoff became very public, with James L. Brooks tweeting at Shearer to come back and talk, and Gene telling reporters that the door was open, but the show was prepared to go on without him. Shearer eventually returned. He signed the same contract as the rest of the main cast, reportedly paying more than $300,000 per episode. There was no break in production, and the crisis passed. But it was a reminder of just how fragile the show's foundations could be. The Simpsons depended entirely on a small group of people whose voices could not truly be replaced. Without Castellaneta, there was no Homer. Without Kavner, there was no Marge. Without Cartwright, there was no Bart. Without Smith, there was no Lisa. These actors had been playing these characters for decades, and their voices were as much a part of the show's identity as the animation or the writing. That reality became even more apparent in 2024, when Pamela Hayden announced her retirement from voice acting. Hayden had been part of The Simpsons for 35 years and had appeared in nearly 700 episodes. She was best known as the voice of Milhouse Van Houten, Bart's best friend and one of the most beloved supporting characters in the show's history. She also voiced Jimbo Jones, Rod Flanders, Janie, Malibu Stacy, and several other recurring characters. In a statement, Hayden said the time had come to hang up her microphone and that it had been an honor and a joy to work on such a funny, witty, and groundbreaking show. She said she would always have a special place in her heart for that blue-haired 10-year-old boy with glasses. Unlike the retirements of Phil Hartman's and Marsha Wallace's characters, Milhouse was too important to the show to simply disappear. Fox confirmed that the role would be recast, and singer Kelly MacLeod was brought in to take over. It was one of the first times in the show's history that a main recurring character played by one of the regular cast members was handed to a completely new performer rather than being retired. The decision highlighted a question that showrunner Matt Selman addressed in a 2025 interview. When asked about the possibility of the show continuing past its current voice actors, Selman admitted it would be an existential threat that he preferred not to think about. He pointed out that when characters like Kermit the Frog from the Muppets had been recast with new voice actors, fans could always tell the difference, and it was never quite the same. The voice acting controversies and changes of this period represented a fundamental shift in how The Simpsons operated. For 30 years, the show had functioned with a tiny cast, playing a massive world of characters, and nobody had questioned the arrangement. Now the rules were different. Characters of color needed to be voiced by actors of color. Retiring actors needed to be replaced rather than having their characters disappear. The show had to navigate a cultural landscape that was asking more from entertainment than it ever had before, and it had to do so while maintaining the identity and continuity of a series that had been running since 1989. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. These changes were happening at the same time that the show's entire business model was being transformed by forces far bigger than any casting decision. The rise of streaming, the acquisition of Fox by one of the largest entertainment companies on Earth, and the challenge of bringing 30 years of classic television to a new generation of viewers on a new platform were all converging at once. The Simpsons was about to enter the streaming era, and the transition would bring its own set of controversies, including one involving the simple question of what shape the picture on your screen should be. Section 11. Disney, streaming, and The Simpsons as a legacy property. For most of its existence, The Simpsons lived in one place. It was a Fox show. It aired on the Fox network. It was produced by Gracie Films and 20th Century Fox Television. The relationship between The Simpsons and Fox went all the way back to the very beginning, to those first crude animated shorts on The Tracy Ullman Show in 1987, to the Christmas special that launched the series in 1989, to the contract that James L. Brooks negotiated preventing Fox from interfering with the show's content. Fox had taken a chance on a weird little cartoon at a time when the network itself was barely established, and The Simpsons had repaid that bet many times over by helping turn Fox into a legitimate competitor to the big three networks. For 30 years, The Simpsons and Fox were inseparable. And then, in 2019, that changed. The Simpsons got a new owner, and not just any owner, the biggest entertainment company on the planet. In March 2019, the Walt Disney Company completed its acquisition of 21st Century Fox. It was one of the largest media deals in history, and it brought an enormous library of film and television properties under the Disney umbrella. The X-Men, Avatar, the Alien franchise, National Geographic, and hundreds of other titles all became Disney properties overnight. And right there in the middle of all of it, sitting alongside some of the most valuable entertainment brands ever created, was The Simpsons, a show that had spent its entire life poking fun at corporate America, that had mocked Disney specifically on multiple occasions over the years, that had built its identity on being the rebellious alternative to mainstream entertainment, was now owned by the most mainstream entertainment company in the world. The deal meant that The Simpsons would continue to air new episodes on the Fox broadcast network, but everything else about the show's distribution and business fell under Disney's control. And Disney had big plans for its new acquisition because it was about to launch a streaming service that would change the entertainment industry, and The Simpsons was going to be one of its biggest attractions. Disney Plus launched on November 12, 2019, and for the first time ever, the entire library of Simpsons episodes was available to stream in one place. Every season, from the very first Christmas special all the way through the most recent episodes, was there for subscribers to watch whenever they wanted. It was a massive selling point for the new service. The Simpsons was one of the most recognizable television brands in the world, and having exclusive streaming access to every episode was a powerful draw for potential subscribers. Disney knew this, and they promoted The Simpsons heavily as a cornerstone of the Disney Plus launch. But almost immediately there was a problem, and it was a problem that fans noticed within hours of the service going live. When Disney Plus uploaded the classic Simpsons episodes, they presented all of them in the widescreen 16:9 format. Every single episode from season 1 through the current seasons was displayed in the same wide rectangular shape on screen. For the episodes from season 20 onward, this was perfectly fine, because those episodes had been produced natively in widescreen. But for the first 19 seasons and part of season 20, the episodes had been originally produced in the old 4:3 format, the almost square shape that matched the televisions of that era. To make those older episodes fill the wider screen, the picture had been cropped. The top and bottom of the original frames had been cut off, and the remaining image had been stretched to fit the wider shape. Disney said at the time of launch that they chose to release the episodes in the 16:9 format in order to guarantee visual quality and consistency across all 30 seasons. They wanted every episode to look the same on screen, filling the modern television display without any black bars on the sides. It was a decision made for visual uniformity, but it came at a serious cost. By cropping the original frames, entire portions of scenes were being cut out. And for a show like The Simpsons, which packed visual gags and background jokes into every corner of every frame, losing even a small part of the picture could mean losing a punchline. The most famous example of what went wrong became one of the first things fans shared online after Disney Plus launched. In the Season 4 episode, Selma's Choice, there is a scene where the characters visit the Duff Beer Brewery. In the original 4:3 version of the episode, you can clearly see 3 different pipes labeled Duff, Duff Light, and Duff Dry, and the joke is that all 3 pipes are connected to the exact same source. Every variety of Duff beer is literally the same product coming from the same place. It is a classic Simpsons visual gag, the kind of joke that rewards careful viewers who pay attention to the details in the background. But in the cropped 16:9 version on Disney Plus, the tops and bottoms of the frame are cut off, and you can no longer see all 3 pipes at once. The joke is completely destroyed. The punchline is invisible. This was not an isolated case. Across hundreds of episodes spanning nearly 2 decades of the show, visual gags were being ruined, background details were being lost, and the carefully composed shots that the animators had designed for the original 4:3 format were being butchered by the crop. Fans were furious. Social media lit up with screenshots comparing the original versions to the Disney Plus versions, showing exactly what was being lost. The backlash was loud, immediate, and sustained. It was not the first time this had happened either. Back in 2014, the cable network FXX had aired classic Simpsons episodes in widescreen on its channel and its streaming app, and fans had complained about the exact same problem. FXX eventually added an option to watch in the original 4:3 format, but it took months for them to respond. Disney Plus seemed to be making the same mistake all over again, but on a much larger scale. The pressure from fans was intense, and Disney listened. In early April 2020, the company announced that it was working to make the first 19 seasons and the applicable episodes from season 20 available in their original 4:3 format on Disney Plus. They expected to have the fix in place by the end of May. On May 28, 2020, longtime showrunner Al Jean shared the news that the switch had been made. Classic episodes could now be viewed in their original aspect ratio. Subscribers were given a toggle option in the Disney Plus settings that let them choose between the cropped widescreen versions and the original format. If the toggle was set to show the original versions, episodes that had been made in 4:3 would display that way, with black bars on the sides of the screen, but with the full picture intact, exactly as the creators had intended. The engineering team at Disney described the project as a significant technical challenge. Blending video images with subtitle tracks, audio tracks, and streaming data while giving viewers a choice between 2 different formats for hundreds of episodes was complicated work. But they got it done, and the response from fans was overwhelmingly positive. People were genuinely relieved to have the classic episodes restored to their proper format. The whole episode was a reminder of just how much fans cared about The Simpsons, even episodes that were 20 or 30 years old. These were not just old television shows to the people who loved them. They were cultural treasures and every detail mattered. The Disney Plus launch also revealed another notable absence from The Simpsons library. The Season 3 premiere, Stark Raving Dad, which first aired on September 19, 1991, was missing from the service. The episode featured a guest appearance by Michael Jackson, who voiced a character named Leon Kompowski, a large white man in a mental institution who believed he was Michael Jackson. Jackson had actually provided the speaking voice for the character, though a sound-alike named Kip Lennon performed the singing parts because Jackson's contract with his record label prevented him from singing on the show. The episode had been pulled from circulation following the release of the 2019 documentary Leaving Neverland, which detailed allegations of child abuse against Jackson. Al Jean and the show's producers made the decision to remove the episode from rotation and from future distribution. It was not included on Disney Plus at launch and has remained unavailable on the service. Beyond the technical and content controversies, the move to Disney Plus represented a fundamental shift in how The Simpsons reached its audience. For 30 years, the show had existed primarily as a broadcast television program. You watched it when it aired on Sunday nights, or you caught it in reruns on syndication, or later through the FXX cable network and its app. The experience of watching The Simpsons was tied to the rhythms of traditional television. You waited for new episodes each week. You stumbled onto classic episodes while flipping through channels. The show was part of the flow of broadcast life. Streaming changed all of that. With every episode available on demand, viewers could watch whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, in whatever order they wanted. New fans could start from the very beginning and work their way through the entire series at their own pace. Old fans could revisit their favorite episodes without waiting for them to show up in syndication. The Simpsons was no longer something that happened to you at a scheduled time. It was something you chose to go to whenever you felt like it. For a show with over 700 episodes at the time of the Disney Plus launch, the streaming model was ideal. There was an almost endless supply of content for viewers to explore, and the library kept growing with every new season. Disney also began using The Simpsons to produce exclusive content for its streaming platform. Short films and specials were created specifically for Disney Plus, separate from the regular broadcast episodes. These specials often tied into other Disney properties, leaning into the fact that The Simpsons now shared a corporate home with Marvel, Star Wars, Pixar, and the rest of the Disney empire. It was a new kind of content for the show, one that would have been impossible before the acquisition, and it showed how Disney intended to use The Simpsons not just as a television series, but as a brand that could be leveraged across its entire streaming ecosystem. The Disney era also coincided with continued changes in the show's broadcast format. Seasons began to get shorter. Where the show had once produced over 20 episodes per season during its peak years, the newer seasons under Disney's ownership started to shrink. This trend would continue into the mid-2020s, with seasons eventually settling at around 15 broadcast episodes, plus additional Disney Plus exclusive specials. The shorter seasons meant fewer episodes on the Fox broadcast schedule, but the addition of streaming exclusives meant the total output remained significant. For the people who had been watching The Simpsons since the beginning, the Disney era felt like the final transformation of a show that had already gone through so many changes. The scrappy, rebellious cartoon that had once been condemned by the President of the United States was now a jewel in the crown of the world's largest entertainment corporation. The show that had mocked corporate greed and mainstream culture for decades was now being used to sell streaming subscriptions and promote superhero movies. There was an irony there that the show's original creators would have appreciated, and to be fair, The Simpsons itself occasionally acknowledged the absurdity of its new corporate parentage. But there was also something undeniably positive about what Disney brought to the table. The Simpsons was now preserved. Every episode, properly formatted, was available in one place for current and future generations to discover. The show's legacy was secure in a way that it had never been before. Classic episodes that might have been lost in the shuffle of broadcast television were now permanently accessible. New viewers who had never experienced the Golden Age could go back and watch those legendary seasons from the beginning. The Simpsons had become a permanent part of the streaming landscape, and that meant it would continue to find new audiences for as long as the platform existed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show had survived so much by this point. It had survived the end of the Golden Age, the decline debates, the voice acting controversies, the format changes, and now the transition from broadcast institution to streaming content. And it was still going. Still producing new episodes. Still breaking records. Still adding to a legacy that was already unlike anything else in television history. With a renewal through season 40 secured and a sequel to The Simpsons movie officially in development, the Yellow family from Springfield was not just surviving. They were looking ahead to a future that would carry them well into their 4th decade on the air, guided by new leadership and facing a television landscape that looked nothing like the one they had been born into. Section 12, Season 37, Season 40, and The Never-Ending Story. There are television shows that last a long time. There are television shows that become cultural landmarks. And then there is The Simpsons, which has done both of those things to a degree that no other program in American history has ever matched. As of right now, The Simpsons is the longest-running American animated series. It is the longest-running American sitcom. It is the longest-running American scripted primetime television series, both in terms of seasons and in terms of individual episodes. It holds records that may never be broken, because breaking them would require another show to stay on the air, producing new episodes for close to 4 decades. The numbers are staggering. Over 800 episodes, over 36 seasons. Characters who have been voiced by the same actors since 1989. A world so detailed and so densely populated that Springfield feels less like a fictional setting and more like a real place that just happens to be filled with yellow people who have 4 fingers on each hand. The Simpsons is not just a television show at this point, it is an institution, and the latest chapter of its story proves that the institution is not ready to close its doors anytime soon. Season 37 of The Simpsons premiered on September 28, 2025, with an episode called Thrifty Ways to Thieve Your Mother. It aired at 8 p.m. on Sundays, the same night that had been home to The Simpsons for most of its existence. The season concluded its broadcast run on February 15, 2026. Though several additional episodes were produced as Disney Plus exclusives that would continue rolling out through July 2026. This structure, a shorter broadcast season supplemented by streaming specials, represented the new normal for The Simpsons in the Disney era. The days of 22-episode seasons were long gone. Season 37 consisted of 15 broadcast episodes plus 2 Disney Plus exclusive specials, bringing the total to 17 episodes for the season. The biggest milestone of Season 37 was the show's 800th episode, which premiered on December 7th, 2025. 800 episodes. To put that number in perspective, most successful television shows produce somewhere between 100 and 200 episodes over their entire run. A show that reaches 300 episodes is considered exceptionally long-lived. The Simpsons had blown past all of those markers years ago and kept going. Reaching 800 was not just a milestone for The Simpsons, it was a milestone for all of television, a number so large that it seemed almost impossible when you stopped to think about what it actually represented. 800 individual stories, 800 sets of scripts written, voices recorded, frames animated, and episodes delivered to the public. 800 Sunday nights, or Thursday nights, or whatever night the show happened to be airing that particular season, where a new Simpsons episode was available for the world to watch. But perhaps the most significant behind-the-scenes change during this period was one that had been building for years. Al Jean, the man who had been running The Simpsons for longer than anyone else in its history, finally stepped down as showrunner. Jean had first taken the showrunner chair alongside Mike Reiss back in Season 3 in 1991. He left after Season 4, came back to the show as a writer in Season 10, and then reclaimed the showrunner position on his own, starting with Season 13 in 2001. From that point, he had guided the show for over 2 decades, making him by far the longest-serving showrunner in The Simpsons history, and one of the longest-serving showrunners in the history of American television. The transition away from Jean had been gradual rather than sudden. Starting around Season 33, Matt Selman began sharing showrunner duties with Jean. Selman had been a writer and producer on The Simpsons for years, working his way up through the ranks in much the same way that previous showrunners like Jean himself had done. The idea was to slowly hand over the reins rather than make an abrupt switch, giving Selman time to grow into the role, while Jean was still there to provide guidance and continuity. In November 2025, Jean formally announced that he was stepping down. His final episode as showrunner was Bad Boys for Life, which he wrote himself. It was a fitting end to a remarkable run. After that episode, Selman took over full showrunning duties, while Jean remained on the show as a writer and consulting producer. He did not leave The Simpsons entirely. He was still in the building, still contributing, still part of the operation. But the day-to-day responsibility for the show's creative direction now belonged to someone else for the first time in nearly 25 years. Gene's legacy as showrunner is complicated, as any legacy that long would have to be. He oversaw the show during a period that included some of its most criticized seasons, and former writers openly complained about the direction the show took under his watch. But he also held the show together through an era of unprecedented change in the television industry. He navigated the transition from standard definition to high definition. He managed the show through the Disney acquisition. He dealt with the voice acting controversies and the push for representation. He guided the production of the Simpsons movie, which grossed over $500 million worldwide. He handled the deaths of Marcia Wallace and the retirement of characters like Edna Krabappel with dignity and respect. And he kept the show on the air, continuously, for over 2 decades. That is not something that can be dismissed, regardless of how any individual episode or season is rated by fans and critics. Gene earned 10 Emmy Awards and 2 Peabody Awards for his work on The Simpsons, and his contribution to the show's endurance is beyond debate. With Selman now at the helm, The Simpsons' future is secured for the foreseeable future. In April 2025, Fox handed the show a massive 4-season renewal, extending it through season 40. Each of those seasons will consist of 15 broadcast episodes, plus 2 Disney Plus exclusive specials, keeping new episodes in production through the 2028 to 2029 broadcast season. When season 40 airs, The Simpsons will have been on the air for approximately 40 years. 40 years of continuous production for a single scripted series. It is a number that seems almost fictional itself, the kind of thing a Simpsons writer might have joked about in a future set episode 20 years ago, except it is actually happening. And there is more on the horizon beyond just new episodes. A sequel to The Simpsons movie has been officially announced, with a release date set for September 3rd, 2027. The original film, released in 2007, had been a massive commercial and critical success, but talk of a follow-up had gone quiet for years. Fans had been asking about a second movie for nearly 2 decades, and the confirmation that it was finally happening generated genuine excitement. The timing is interesting, coming just as the show transitions to new leadership under Selman and just as the series approaches its 40th anniversary. A second Simpsons movie in 2027 would arrive 20 years after the first one, a gap that mirrors the long, slow, patient approach that has defined everything about how The Simpsons operates. This show does not rush. One of the most unexpected aspects of The Simpsons in its later years has been the phenomenon of the show's supposed ability to predict the future. Over the course of producing hundreds of episodes covering nearly every topic imaginable, The Simpsons has occasionally appeared to foresee real-world events before they happened. The most famous example is from the season 11 episode Bart to the Future, which aired in 2000 and included a throwaway line mentioning that Donald Trump had become president of the United States. When Trump actually won the presidency in 2016, the clip went viral, and the show's writers were treated like prophets. The chalkboard gag in the season 28 episode Havana Wild Weekend, which aired after the 2016 election, read, "Being right sucks." Other supposed predictions have included everything from the outcome of Super Bowls to corruption scandals to technological developments. The season 3 episode Lisa the Greek correctly predicted the winner of Super Bowl 26, with the Washington team defeating the Buffalo Bills. A repeat of the episode the following year was redubbed to mention the Dallas Cowboys against the Bills, and the Cowboys won that game too. The season 21 episode Boy Meets Curl appeared to foresee the first American men's curling team winning a gold medal at the 2018 Winter Olympics. The season 25 episode You Don't Have to Live Like a Referee seemed to predict the FIFA corruption case that erupted in 2015. The predictions phenomenon has become a cultural force of its own, with social media accounts and YouTube channels dedicated entirely to cataloging every instance where The Simpsons appeared to see the future. But the people who actually make the show have always been careful to put the phenomenon in perspective. Al Jean has explained that the predictions are really just educated guesses, and that if you throw enough darts, you're going to get some bullseyes. Producer Bill Oakley has been even more direct, stating that there are very few cases where The Simpsons actually predicted something, and that it is mainly just coincidence because the episodes are so old that history ends up repeating itself. Fact-checking organizations have debunked many of the claimed predictions, explaining that when a show has produced hundreds of episodes covering almost every conceivable topic, statistical coincidences are inevitable. But the myth persists, and it has become yet another layer of the show's cultural legacy. A reason for people to go back and re-watch old episodes, looking for hidden glimpses of the future. Through all of these changes, milestones, and cultural moments, one thing has remained remarkably constant: the core voice cast. Dan Castellaneta still voices Homer Simpson, just as he has since those crude little shorts on the Tracy Ullman Show in 1987. Julie Kavner is still Marge. Nancy Cartwright is still Bart. Yardley Smith is still Lisa. Harry Shearer still voices Mr. Burns, Ned Flanders, Principal Skinner, and dozens of other characters. Hank Azaria still voices Moe, Chief Wiggum, Professor Frink, Comic Book Guy, and many more, even though he has stepped away from some of his former roles. These 6 people have been the voices of Springfield for over 35 years, and their continued presence is arguably the single most important reason why the show still feels like The Simpsons, despite everything else that has changed around it. Matt Selman addressed the question of what would happen if one of those core actors could no longer continue in a 2025 interview. He called it an existential threat and admitted he did not really know how the team would handle it. He pointed to examples like Kermit the Frog from The Muppets, where new voice actors had taken over after the original performer passed away. Selman noted that fans can always tell when a voice has changed, and it is never quite the same. For now, the question remains hypothetical, but it hangs over the show as a quiet reminder that nothing lasts forever, not even The Simpsons. And yet, looking at the full sweep of this show's history, from Matt Groening's frantic sketches in a lobby in 1987 to the 800th episode in 2025, from the crude animation traced from napkin drawings to the polished high-definition widescreen of today, from a 1-minute bumper on a variety show to a global entertainment property owned by the largest media company on Earth, the story of The Simpsons is unlike anything else in the history of entertainment. No other show has lasted this long. No other show has touched this many people. No other show has woven itself so deeply into the fabric of popular culture that its characters, its catchphrases, and its jokes have become a shared language spoken by people all over the world. The Simpsons started as a last-minute backup plan sketched on a piece of paper by a cartoonist who was too protective of his rabbits to give them to a television network. It became the most important animated program ever made. It survived controversy, corporate ownership changes, cultural shifts, technological revolutions, and the simple grinding challenge of making people laugh week after week for nearly 4 decades. It changed television, it changed animation, it changed the way America thought about families, about comedy, and about what a cartoon could be. And the thing about The Simpsons is that the story is still not over. Season 40 is on the way. A new movie is in production. New episodes are being written and animated and voiced right now by some of the same people who have been doing it for over 30 years. The Simpsons is still here. It is still going. And if the past 4 decades have taught us anything, it is that betting against this show is never a good idea. Springfield is not closing. The lights at 742 Evergreen Terrace are still on. And somewhere in that little yellow house, Homer is probably on the couch, a donut in one hand, the remote in the other, completely unaware that he is the star of the longest, strangest, and most remarkable story in the history of television. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.